Grandpa was born on October 30th, 1945. He and my grandma were the closest thing I had to real parents, and I'm grateful to have had them. My dad was never anything more than a name on a birth certificate, and my mom was in an accident just after I was born. I've lived with my grandparents since I was 8 months old, and I learned so much from them. Grandma taught me to take care of myself, to cook and clean, and how to be responsible for a household. From Granddad, I learned, too many things to list. He taught me to hunt, to fish, to manage my money, to pay my debts, how to be a man. As I said, that's a lot to put on a short description, but Grandpa was a great man. He shared everything with me, the two of us being incredibly close, but I recently found out that he held on to one little secret, the secret to his long life, something I learned on the day that he died. Grandpa always celebrated his birthday in the same way. He would sit on the porch with Grandma, both of them in costume, and pass out candy to trick-or-treaters. Grandpa loved Halloween, always wore a costume, and bought the best candy for the scores of kids that came to the farm. Grandpa was known for his corn mazes, spooky decorations, and the best candy in town. I've always helped with the festivities throughout my childhood, and despite all the smiling kids and happy adults, Grandpa always had the biggest grin on his face. As the porch lights started going off, and the kids started heading home, Grandma would light the candles, and we would sing to Grandpa as he sat smiling at the small pile of candles smoldering on top of his cake. In the candlelight, his face always seemed more lined and seamed than it normally did. Granddad had looked 40 well into his 60s, but he looked about 100 in the light of all those candles. After he blew them out, Grandma would cut pieces off the double chocolate cake, and Grandpa would savor every bite like it might be his last. I asked him about it once, and he just laughed and said that one day I'd understand. Then he'd check his watch, 9:55 on the dot, and he'd excuse himself to go set up in his music room. Calling it a music room doesn't really capture its grandeur. Grandpa, back in his day, was a country music star of sorts. He played on the Grand Ole Opry, joined the band with the Presley Jamboree, and he'd opened for Johnny Cash in his heyday. The room was full of pictures of him playing with everyone from Merle Haggard to Conway Twitty, and his guitar collection was awe-inspiring. Granddad spent a lot of time there, as I remember, and he often wrote songs for artists and recording companies. He would sit there on his birthday, however, and play the same old guitar every time. It was a battered old acoustic, the lacquered white body peeling and ratty, the strings worn to the point of unraveling, and the neck seemed chipped beyond repair. Despite this, it was one of Grandpa's favorites, and he picked it often when he was alone. Despite this, he always looked so thoughtful when he played, like it reminded him of something he'd rather forget. Grandpa would sit in there and practice for a little while, and then, at exactly 10:30, he would call me in, kiss my forehead, and tell me to get to bed. I would always stay up on Grandpa's birthday, even if I had school the next day. At 10:30, though, I would go to bed, and I would always listen to the music from the room as Grandpa played. When I was little, I just listened from my bed, the words making me feel weird. Granddad's voice was smooth, ageless, and I sometimes thought that it must be a younger man who was singing with Granddad. In the beginning, I did think I heard a second voice, but I always put it aside as my ears playing tricks on me. Well, what is this I can't see with ice cold hands getting hold of me? Well, I am death, none can excel. Open the door to heaven or hell. I was 6 the first time I snuck out to listen to Granddad. I was so scared, not because I was breaking the rules, but because it was so dark in the hallway. Granddad had one of those old character lamps, Woody Woodpecker, I think, and the bulb was old and yellow. It made a little island of light, a reprieve in the darkness, and I had to walk through the darkness with something like real terror creeping up my throat. I didn't want to go, not at first, but the music seemed to pull me. The closer I got to the door, the closer it all became. I could hear Grandpa's voice oozing from beneath the door, and it enticed me right up to the lock. Oh, death, won't you spare me over to another year? I knew there was definitely a second voice singing, something low and gravelly, and it oddly harmonized with Grandpa's silky tones. That old guitar, the one with the bone-white body, jangled on the fourth key as the tuner loosened in that slow, careful way that it does. Even this didn't sound at odds with the song. It all came together like a dying body singing its final notes. Granddad played, the stranger singing harmony with him, and I leaned against the door as I listened to them. "Oh, death, someone would pray, could you wait to calm it just another day? The children prayed, the preacher preached, time and mercy are out of your reach." I left before the song was over, climbing into bed and covering up as Granddad finished playing and went to bed himself. I never heard his guest leave, just Grandpa sharing a few quiet words before leaving his music room and heading to bed. Even at 6, I knew that was weird, but I didn't think much of it. I was young, and my brain was involved in other matters, like Ninja Turtles and the third Mario game. I guess that was when I started paying attention to Granddad's yearly ritual. I was young, so it was only precursory at best. I noticed Granddad pass out candy, run the yearly carnival, eat his cake, and then retire to his music room. After I'd gone to bed, he would play that song, his strange guest singing along, and I would sit at the door and listen. It was always the same song, the mournful tone that made my skin prickle. The voice singing with him was part of it, I realized. But I didn't know exactly what I was hearing until much later. I just assumed that he had some friend who came over late to celebrate his birthday, with some songs and maybe a few drinks. "I'll fix your feet till you can't walk, lock your jaw so you can't talk, close your eyes so you can't see, this very hour come and go with me." The way the guitar shivered in his hand as his dexterous fingers rang the sounds from the strings was magical. I'd seen his fingers grow thicker and thicker as the arthritis took the mobility from his hands, but it never seemed to extend to his playing. On nights like tonight, though, it was like having my grandfather play in his 20s again. His nimble fingers playing on the aging guitar were ghostly, and I became more scared of the music than anything in the hallway. "I have come to take your soul, leave the body and leave it cold, to drop the flesh from off the frame, earth and worms will have their claim." I was 12 when I asked him about the strange jam sessions he had. I was eating eggs and grits at the table, the school bus still an hour away, and the yawn that interrupted my eating made Grandpa chuckle as he entered the kitchen. "Stay up too late reading your funny books again?" Grandpa asked, shaking out his newspaper. He'd been awake since the sun's edges graced the sky, and his hands were already gray with soil. Granddad's father had been a farmer, just like his father before him. Granddad had kept the tradition alive, despite not needing to. Granddad hadn't been foolish with his money like some of his contemporaries had been. He had bought land, invested in things that lasted, and now in his old age, he rested on his laurels. "Nah," I said, deciding to ask the question that had been bugging me for years. "I guess I heard you playing last night and just couldn't get to sleep." Grandpa hummed from behind his paper, but I could tell that the question was something he was considering. It was November 1st, and Grandpa had gone through his usual routine last night, complete with jam session. I had lingered outside the door, my hand on the knob as I listened, and I had only just slipped back in my room when he came out. The whole time he played, I had thought about just throwing the door open and seeing who was singing with him, but the idea seemed tantamount to walking in on Gramps while he was in the shower. Plus, hell, there was something about the person singing with him that scared me a little. I couldn't put my finger on it, but that was not a man to be crept up on. "Who do you play with every year, Gramps?" I asked, keeping eye contact with the back of his paper as he hid behind it. "I never see them leave, but I know I've heard them." Grandpa was quiet for a little while, long enough for me to think that he wouldn't answer. "It's an old friend, kiddo." I took a few more bites as I waited for him to elaborate, but he didn't. Grandma put some breakfast down in front of him, and Grandpa folded his paper and began to eat. I watched the eggs and bacon being forked into his mouth, giving him a moment before plunging onward. Grandpa didn't like being prodded, especially when he was eating, but I needed some answers. So who are they? I've never seen them come in or even leave after. You don't need to know. It's none of your business, kiddo, so don't be nosy. My curiosity was piqued, but Grandpa had made it pretty clear that the subject was closed. It wouldn't do any good to argue once his mind was made up either, but that wouldn't stop me from continuing my investigation. I asked Grandma about it, but she wouldn't tell me much either. It's something your grandpa's done since he was young. He told me after we were married that it was something he had to do once a year and that I couldn't bother him while he was doing it. The consequences would be dire, is all he would say when I asked him why. When I asked her why he did it at night, she told me that Grandpa had said that he was born at night. He was born at 10:46 on Halloween. He says that has something to do with it, but he's never told me more than that, and I've never asked. Your grandfather is a heck of a man, but business is business. You might not like what you find if you go poking around either, kiddo. I didn't fully understand at 12, but it made me hungry to know more. Oh, death, whoa, death, won't you spare me over till another year? I spent the next 10 years crouching outside the door, listening to the song. I'd learned the song, it was an old one, and Grandpa played it better than anyone I'd ever heard. Grandpa played it as though he was busking to buy daily bread. He put his heart and soul into every word, which somehow changed the words. It was something I looked forward to every year, and part of the reason I asked Grandpa to teach me how to play in the first place. My mother came to my bed, placed a cold towel upon my head. My head is warm, my feet are cold, death's a moving upon my soul. Grandpa was thrilled when I asked him to teach me. I was 13 and I wanted to know how to make music like him. He told me not to get too ahead of myself, but agreed to teach me after school. He was pretty clear that my schooling had to come first, but he was more than happy to teach me the chords and some techniques. We practiced after school every day, Grandpa taking me through the basics with ease. I took to it pretty quick, Grandpa saying I must have gotten the knack from him, and pretty soon I was playing the usual teenage standbys. Grandpa rolled his eyes as I played Wonderwall and Chop Suey, playing along as I powered through Bridge Over Troubled Waters or House of the Rising Sun. Grandpa taught me some of the old shit-kicking tunes he used to cut his teeth on at the honky-tonks, and soon I was playing along with most of what he threw at me. It wasn't until I picked at the first few chords to the song I'd heard him play on his birthday that he covered my hand and stopped me. Not that song, kid. Never play that song. That song is... I only play that song once a year, and never until then. Oh, death, how you treating me? Closed my eyes so I can't see. Well, you're hurting my body, you make me cold. You run my life right out of my soul. Grandpa and I played every chance we got, and as the years proceeded, I found I liked playing music with him. I always played for fun, though. I never made it more than something to impress girls at a bonfire, or wow my friends at the talent show. By 16, I knew what I wanted to do with my life. Music was fun, but I loved discovering how things worked. Machines were my passion, but I loved taking anything apart and discovering how it functioned. Granddad supported my plans to go to college after high school, and for graduation, he presented me with a beautiful acoustic guitar. So you don't forget to have fun while you're working your ass off, kiddo. Oh, death, consider my age. Please don't take me at this stage. My wealth is all at your command. If only you'll move your ice-cold hand. Tonight, Grandpa celebrated his 75th birthday in the same way he always did. He dressed as Old MacDonald, Grandma as Mrs. MacDonald, in a long flowery dress, and they handed out candy to cowboys and aliens and various superheroes. I've been living with them while I attend college, and as the kids left and the floodlights went out for the night, I slid the comically large cow head off and joined my grandparents on the porch. Grandma had a double chocolate cake, alight with 75 burning candles. As we ate our cake, I couldn't help but notice that Grandpa looked a little different tonight. Not sad, but speculative. Like this might be the last piece of Grandma's cake he ever ate. When I got up to take my plate to the kitchen, Grandpa put a hand on my arm and asked Grandma if she would mind taking my plate too. She said not a bit, and took all 3 plates to the kitchen so she could wash up. Grandpa looked at me, his face asking the question before his mouth, and it was the question I'd been waiting to hear my whole life. Would you like to come and play with me tonight? I was speechless. How long had I waited for just that very thing? I nodded at him and followed him to the music room with excitement and apprehension. I was finally going to get to meet Grandpa's mysterious guest, the one I'd heard singing for so many years. I remembered the way that touching the doorknob had made me feel, and wondered if I could even play in his presence. Oh, the young, the rich, the poor, all alike to me you know. No wealth, no land, silver or gold, nothing satisfies but your soul. He was waiting for us when we came into the studio. He was, well, there was no way to describe him. He was tall, not height-wise, but more long than tall, I guess. His fingers were especially long, and I wondered if he played guitar too. He was dressed in white, his pristine suit complete with a bolo tie, and his hat was a tall 10-gallon that made him look like a rancher on a western. His face gave me the willies, though. He looked like someone had stretched a very believable flesh mask over a cow skull. The bones in his cheeks poked out oddly. His ears were long and curved in strange ways. His eyes were hollow, like a skull, and looking at him made me a little ill. Who was this guy? How did he know my granddad? He must be important if Granddad would spend his birthday evening with him every year.
Ah, Ramon. Good to see you.
Azzy, Granddad said, taking his guitar off the wall. Long time no see.
365 days to be exact. So you play for me tonight?
Grandpa looked at the guitar, the bone-white body looking odd against his tan skin, and smiled as he walked towards me. Nope, my grandson is. He pushed the guitar into my hand and took a seat beside me. The guitar felt strange, like nothing I'd ever held before. The neck felt porous, almost like driftwood, and the body was coarse against my skin. There was a smell to it, something like moldy wood, and I realized I had never actually played this guitar before. Grandpa played it sometimes, but other than the nights like this, he didn't seem to want to touch it. The stranger looked at me expectantly, and as I strummed the chords, I could only think of one song I wanted to play. The song I had heard so many times spilling out from under that door, spilled from my own mouth like he had gutted me. The words bubbled out as I sang for death's reprieve, for death's abatement, and as I sang, I felt the stranger watching me. Though my call was to death, it felt as if this stranger were the one I was truly singing to. I felt like his eyes were boring into me, seeing my worth, and as the song came to a close, he clapped his hands together in mock good cheer. His hands coming together sounded like bones rattling in a crypt.
Well done, kid. You got chops. Maybe not chops as big as your grandpa here, but chops. Take it this means our deal's at an end, Ramon?
Granddad nodded, reaching for the guitar and nodding to me. Head to bed, kid. Azzy and I have some business to discuss. I told him I'd see him tomorrow, but I doubted him when he said he was sure he would. I wept as I lay in bed, not knowing why. Grandma woke me up the next morning. She was crying, her words slurred as she told me that Grandpa was in his music room. He had passed in the chair that he always sat in when he played music. The doctors said it had been a heart attack, that he likely hadn't suffered. I hadn't needed him to tell me that. When I came across Grandpa in his music room, he had the most satisfied smile on his face. That white guitar was laying across his lap, and when I picked it up, I put it away, the touch of it making my skin crawl. I was kind of numb through the funeral, unable to come to terms with what I'd seen. Had that man, the one that Grandpa had called Azzy, been responsible for his death? How had he given Grandpa a heart attack? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made, but I felt like he had something to do with all of this. Grandpa's note, however, brought it all into perspective. Grandpa left me his music room in his will. All the guitars were mine, all the awards, all the music memorabilia, a binder of songs that he hadn't sold yet. It was a generous gift, given on the grounds that I stay in school and help Grandma keep the house up. The house would be mine after Grandma was gone, but I hoped that would be many years away. I found myself there after the funeral, as my eyes strayed to that strange guitar again, and I wondered how I had missed the note. It was slid under the strings on the neck, and the white paper stood out like a surrender flag. I picked it up, trying not to touch the guitar, and unfolded it to see Grandpa's neat handwriting. "If you're reading this, kid, then I'm gone. The music room's yours, and I hope you'll take good care of the things in it as I did. I've had a long and happy life, kiddo, and it was made better by watching you grow into a fine man. You'll make a fantastic engineer one day, but for now, I want to talk about the music. I've been playing and singing since I could walk, but it wasn't until Azzy saw me at the Bent Spoon one night that I really got my break. I saw him watching me as I played. How could you miss him, even in a crowd? The longer he watched, the more intent on me he became, and after I was finished, he approached me with an offer. He gave me that guitar, the strange one that I sometimes play, the one that feels like rotten wood, and told me to play. He said as long as I played music with it, I'd be successful, have the kind of money that I could only dream of, and have a long and fruitful life. The trade-off, though, was twofold. Once a year at the time of my birth, I would play that song for him. If I missed a year, then the deal was off, and my life would end. The other part was that, after my death, I would come to his world and play for him for all time. You're a smart kid, like I was a smart kid. You likely realize that Azrael to everyone but me, ain't human. If you take up that guitar and play for him, you can live as I lived. You can be a star. You can live comfortably. But you'll be with him when it's all said and done. I regretted my decisions at leisure, having acted in haste in my youth, but I felt it was time to make good on my deal. I know that when I die, I won't sit at the right hand of God, as it says in those songs I've sung sometimes. I don't know what awaits me, but 75 years is a long time to walk the skin of the earth. I'm tired, kiddo. It seems like a good time to lay my burdens down. I don't know where I'm going, but I hope I don't see you there someday. Tell Melinda I love her, and watch over her until God calls her home. I won't tell you not to take up the guitar, but if you do, I feel like you should know the consequences. I love you, kiddo. Have a great life. Love, Grandpa." That was 5 years ago. Grandma passed away before I graduated college, but I became the engineer that I always wanted to be. I've got a great job. I'm seeing an amazing woman that I mean to propose to next month, and I've made my grandpa's home my own. I still sit in my grandpa's music room sometimes, though, and strum a few chords or play something we played together. The white guitar hasn't moved since I put it on the wall the day that Grandpa died, and I don't intend to ever take it down again. Sometimes, though, I get the itch to pick it up and play it, especially on my birthday at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I don't think it or its owner will be content with Wonderwall or House of the Rising Sun, though. No, I think it wants something older, something blacker, and I think the bargain will be for something harder to pin down than time or wealth. I may not want to, but I fear that someday I'll take up Grandpa's guitar, and the bargain will be the same as it was for him so many years ago. I fear that one day I'll trade my soul to death so he might spare me over till another year. "Hey, you live at the Murphy farm, right?" I looked up, not sure I had heard them. No one had ever actually talked to me before, so it was a little weird to have it happen. "I'm a farm kid. My dad is called Farmer Murphy, though that's not actually our name. He bought the Murphy farm, the 120 acres of farmland containing 2 cow barns, a large chicken shed, an orchard, and several fish ponds. Dad made quite a lot of money working the farm, enough to afford a small army of farmhands, and we've run about 3 pumpkin patches already this year. With that kind of money, Dad thought it would be fitting to send me to a private school. Maybe he thought I could get some good education that would allow me to be more than a farmer. Maybe he thought I would have a head for business and take the farm to new heights. But whatever he had hoped, it didn't leave me a lot of room for making friends. I'm not an unpersonable guy. I don't keep to myself or bully anyone. But the kids at the private school know that my dad is a farmer. They can smell the cow crap on my boots, and they can see me work the pumpkin patch when they come to get their jack-o'-lanterns. They laugh at me behind my back. They call me Jethro and think I must be dumb and simple. This leads most of them to shun me or ignore me, and that's about how I've spent the last 2 months since we moved here. Until now, it seems. Yeah, I said, looking up from my notebook. Told ya, said a blonde girl. I thought her name was Rose or Lily or something like that, but the kid who had asked me if I lived at Murphy Farm was Derek. Derek was the one who had called me Abner and pretended to smell crap on my boots, even when they were clean. Well, hey, we were wondering if we could see it. You know, we're real interested in farming, aren't we, guys? There were 5 of them, 2 girls and 3 boys, and they were smiling way too big. Derek was part of the student council. The girl, who was either Lily or Rose, and the other girl, Helen maybe, were cheerleaders. The other 2 were Stan and Guthrie, guys on the football team and pseudo-bullies. They had certainly bullied me, though not physically. I was a big guy, too much time spent bucking hay and digging with a hoe, but they didn't mind picking on me. This was the most genial conversation we had ever had, actually. Since when? I asked, looking between the 5 of them distrustfully. Derek sighed as his smile slipped a little. Okay. We really just need someone to say it's okay for us to be there at dusk. We want to do the Corn Man Challenge, and your dad has the only cornfield in about 30 miles. It was my turn to roll my eyes. You know that's fake, right? There's no real corn man. Well, duh, Guthrie said. We aren't babies. We just want to do it for TikTok. They've been going viral lately, and we want to see if ours will, too. I didn't really do TikTok much. I was usually listening to audiobooks or something on my phone if I was working in the field, but even I had heard about this one. The Corn Man was an old legend that had blown up recently. The kids were making videos in fields of themselves, standing as still as scarecrows while they sang the creepy little song that summoned him. He never came, of course, but some of them were supposed to be kind of spooky. The legend said that if you could prove to the Corn Man that you could stand still in the face of his horrible visage, then he had to grant you a wish. But it was all superstitious nonsense. You might as well ask the milk cow for wishes than some corn man. Even so, though, I supposed maybe I could work this to my advantage. I don't know, I said, putting on the hokey accent I sometimes used. I'd have to run the tractor when you get done, so there wouldn't be any footprints in the corn. Tractor gas is a little expensive. I pretended to think about it. I could run it for, maybe $15 a head. They had their phones out before I even finished, asking for my Cash App ID so they could send me the money. I'm not as stupid as they think, and of course, I had Cash App. I'd had my eye on a couple of new games, and $75 would get me a long way towards them. I nodded as the money was received, Derek actually labeling it tractor gas, and I told them that I would meet them on the edge of the east field at 5:30 that afternoon. The sun'll just be setting, so it'll give you time to set up before it gets too low. They agreed, and as they went away, chattering quietly, I sent out another text, preparing for this evening. I met them at 5:35 that afternoon by the East Field, surprised that they had known which one to come to. Sometimes city people got turned around. "Come on," I said, disappearing into the corn. "It isn't far." Derek told me to hang on, the girls complaining that they didn't know they would have to wander through the corn. I didn't. I just made my way to the spot near the left edge of the field and took a seat on a big rock. The spot was a little weird. No matter what Dad did to it, nothing would grow there. The rock was there to mark it, and as they came out of the corn and saw the little 15 by 15 area, they started squawking about how it was perfect. One of the girls had a tripod. Her Cash App ID said Lily Rose, so maybe I had been right on both parts. And they set up a phone as they tried to get the right angle. I just sat on the rock and watched them, looking at the sun as it rode lower and waiting for them to begin. "Okay," Derek said, "let's all join hands and get started." The other girl, turned out her name was Heather, pressed a little button in her hand, and they began. "Corn man, come to me if you can. Corn man, I can stand as the cornstalks stand. Corn man, still as a stone, not like a man. Corn man, still and quiet as the cornstalks can." They chanted the words, then they stood stock still in the cornfield. The plants waved, giving no notice to the 5 high school kids who stood like statues in their midst. It was silly. Cornstalks didn't stand still at all. Whoever had come up with this story had clearly never spent a lot of time around corn. "Nothing's happening," Helen whispered. "Give it a minute," Derek whispered back. "How long does it take?" Stan whispered. But before Derek could answer, they heard a rustling sound in the cornfield. I lay on my rock, staying still and listening to the rustle of something moving amidst the corn plants. "Is that him?" Lily Rose asked. "Shh, you're supposed to be still," Derek hissed. They stayed there as the sun set, stalks rustling like insects around them, and suddenly it stepped from the corn like a phantom. He was huge, nearly 7 feet tall, and he was a mass of burlap sacks and chains. He had an axe in one hand and a cleaver in the other, and the hockey mask over his face made him look grisly indeed. His boots glumped with crusty mud, and he swung his head from one side to the other as he took in the kids standing in the field. It's the corn man!" Derek shouted, immediately breaking his advice from a moment ago and staggering back a step. You said he wasn't real," Heather gibbered, breaking into a run. I didn't. But whatever Derek did or didn't know was lost as the corn man bellowed like a bull and charged them. They all broke and ran, the corn shaking as they slammed into it and ran in the direction that they had come. No one stayed to get their wish. No one remembered why they had come there. And as someone grabbed the camera, they knocked the tripod over and did not come back for it. They were yelling and screaming all the way to their car, none of them giving a care for their guide, but I didn't mind. The corn man swung his head in my direction as I began to laugh, and as he staggered toward me, I clapped my hands slowly. "Great job, Travis. You're getting pretty good at this." He lifted the mask, smiling as he held his burlap-covered hand out to me. "It's pretty fun to watch them city kids pee their pants and run away." I slapped a 10 spot in his hand, and we headed for the house as Mom rang the bell from the back door. After 2 months of being made fun of and thought of as the stupid farm kid, it's pretty nice to get to watch them get their comeuppance. We stomped through the corn, the stalks parting easily, and Travis looked at the setting sun unhappily. "Hey, cuz, you ain't scared the real corn man will get us for making fun of him, are ya? Travis, don't tell me you actually believe in the corn man. He's just a story. He isn't real." "Nuh-uh. My daddy says," "Travis, your daddy is a drunk who claims he met Bigfoot in Branson, Missouri. He's far from a reliable source." But he says he believes in him, and that means he has to be real, right? It was hard to believe sometimes that Travis was a year older than I was. Travis was 17 and huge for his age. The local high schools were trying to get him to play football for them, same as they did every year. But Travis and Uncle Zeke were our best hands, and Dad really couldn't spare Travis so he could toss a ball around. Zeke depended on his son's added pay so he could properly pickle himself too, so he didn't push the matter. Travis, don't believe everything your old man says. Sometimes you have to come up with your own ideas about things, you know? Travis chewed that over as we came into the barn, leaving his costume in the barn before we went in for dinner. Okay, so my earlier comments may have been a little disingenuous. I didn't lie. I've always been the big, supposedly dumb farm kid for the 2 months that I've been at this private school Dad sent me to. But just here recently, I've become more approachable by my peers. Derek and his friends are about the 4th group that's paid for the pleasure of having the shit scared out of them in my dad's cornfield, and I expected they wouldn't be the last. The first group that had approached me had been pure coincidence. Travis had come whistling through the fields as they stood stock still, and they had bolted in fear before he'd even come out of the corn. After that, I'd cut him in, put together a costume, and he blundered into every corn man summoning from then on. It's not technically a lie. People pay more than I charge for haunted houses, and I've certainly been cashing in given the time of year. People expect a scare around Halloween. They crave it, and I'm just giving them what they want. I think deep down they know there's no corn man, but it's the adrenaline rush that draws them in. I'm just providing the ambience. Derek's video went up the next day and did very well. He even tagged Murphy Farm in it, which was nice. He seemed surprised when I was in class the next day, and I had to explain to him that I had stayed still like you were supposed to do, and the corn man had gone away. That seemed to work, and he nodded as he thought about it. I went back to my assignment as the rest of the class joked about Derek and his run-in with the legendary corn man. I got approached by a new group at lunch, 4 guys from the football team, who wanted to go see this corn man too. I told them I would need to run the stock lifter, something that ran on diesel and was kind of pricey, and they shelled out $20 a head for the privilege of using the field. I laughed to myself, $80 the richer, and when a new shadow fell over my lunch, I looked up to find the last person I had expected. Hey, I heard you can summon the corn man. I was hoping I could tag along. Marjorie Stokes was not someone I would have thought would fall for all this corn man nonsense. Marjorie was here on an academic scholarship, one of about 5 given every year, and her grades reflected. Like me, however, she wasn't from the usual student background, and the others picked on her. We weren't friends. I don't know as we'd ever shared so much as a class together, but I did know of her. Yeah, I said. Why? Do you want to set up a time? I was hoping I could just tag along with those guys from earlier. I want to see what there is to this corn man thing. Well, it's generally $20 a head, but I'm mostly just gouging those guys. For you, I'd do 10. Just don't tell anybody. She nodded, reaching into her purse and pulling out a 20. I can pay. Where and when do I meet you? I slid the 20 into my pocket, respecting her desire for fairness. 6, by the East Field. It's the one with all the corn in it. You can't miss it. She told me she would be there, and walked quickly off so she could get her own lunch. I shot a text to Travis, telling him we had more people looking for the corn man, and he said he'd be ready. I smiled as I chewed, happy that business was booming, and reflected that it would kind of suck to go back to being the big dumb farm kid again once Halloween was over. It would suck, but I wouldn't mind returning to being a nobody either. Having a full social calendar was kind of a pain, and it was only a matter of time before Dad noticed that I was doing something out in the field and put a stop to it. Till then, though, let there be corn man. The sun was sinking below the corn as a little red hatchback pulled up along the fence line, and I saw Marjorie hop out and adjust her cardigan. "Am I late?" she asked, not seeing anybody. About that time, I heard the exhaust of a large F-250 as it came into view, and I shook my head. "Nope, looks like you're early." The 4 burly football players piled out, giving Marjorie a questioning side-eye, and I told them to follow me as we headed into the corn. They came along noisily, talking and joking as they pushed the corn aside, and when the 5 of them had come into the field, the biggest one turned and tossed me his phone. "You got the recording, right?" I nodded and lined up the shot, the 4 of them laughing as Marjorie came to join them. They were all very cavalier about the whole thing, but I noticed that Marjorie was almost shaking with anticipation. She was quiet, almost stoic, and as they took their positions, she seemed ready to fight to get what she wanted. I lined up the shot, telling them to start when they wanted, and the 5 of them began to chant as the corn swallowed the last line of the setting sun behind the stalks. Corn man, come to me if you can. Corn man, I can stand as the corn stalks stand. Corn man, still as a stone, not like a man. Corn man, still and quiet as the corn stalks can. The ritual complete, they stood there like statues as they waited for the coming of the corn man. I sat too, holding the phone as I recorded them, and the glowing remains of the sun behind them looked pretty cool. This would definitely make a great video. I hope they remembered to tag the farm in it, but as I sat there watching them twitch and glance around, something felt different this time. The crickets were silent, the night birds had gone still, and I was suddenly aware of how absolutely noiseless the world had become. It's rare to be in a field at night and hear nothing, and it made me think of something Dad had told me on a hunting trip once. When the birds and bugs go quiet, it usually means something big is around, something big and something bad. I breathed a sigh of relief when the corn began to rustle. There he was, I thought, as the stalks shook and the assembled kids began to shudder. He was later than usual, but the big oaf sometimes forgot that he was supposed to be here. Travis could be flaky, but I was glad he hadn't forgot our arrangement. When the thing broke free of the corn, I knew in an instant that it wasn't Travis. This thing was made of corn stalks and roots. Its arms were wound together plant fibers, and its legs were thick and muscled with the bulging veins of vegetation. Its face looked like a pagan idol, the features made of delicate silk and weathered corn stalks, and the eyes blazed at the assembled children like the coals of a fire. "Holy shit! What the fuck is that?" one of them shouted, and the thing turned its head to look at him about a second before one of those arms came up and wrapped itself around him. I heard his bones break, his skin tear, and his final horrified screams were cut off as he was torn to pieces. The others ran then, the 3 football players sprinting into the corn, but I was frozen to the spot on top of my rock. I watched as it went after them, my eyes locked on the bloody remains of the kid whose name I had never bothered to learn, and from the rock I heard the thing as it caught them. They screamed like trapped animals, their fear and their pain a living thing. But as I looked up, I noticed that someone hadn't run. Margaret was still there, her cardigan splattered in blood and her face full of terror, but she refused to move. She was stock still, her chest barely rising, and when I glanced down, I remembered that I was still recording. The kid's phone had caught all of it, and as the thing came stomping back, I tried to keep everything in frame so I could prove that I'd had no part in this. At least one person had been torn to shreds on my dad's land, and I was not about to go to prison for some psycho that had been hiding in the east field. As it came lumbering out of the field, it looked at Margaret, and made its laborious way over to her. To her credit, she never moved, though I could see the tears sliding down her face as they joined the gore there. It stood far taller than it had any right to be, its body blocking the light of the moon as it fell across her. It seemed to judge her with those living coal eyes. "Ye have proven thyself worthy of my boon, child. What do you ask of the Corn Man?" Her voice shook only a little, but I still heard it from my rock. "Please, my mother has cancer. Cure her, I beg you. She's all I have in this world. Please, take her cancer from her and let her live." The Corn Man nodded his head slowly, and it sounded like trees bending in the wind. "Granted," he whispered, and as he disappeared into the cornfield, I could see the red running off him and hear the creak of the stalks as he vanished. The police found the bodies of Trevor Parks, Nathaniel Moore, Gabriel, and Michael Roos in the field that night. Dad was pretty mad when he learned what I'd been doing, but the video cleared me of any involvement in the deaths. Travis had thankfully been busy in the cowshed with a particularly fussy milk cow, and had remembered that he was supposed to be the Corn Man about 10 minutes after sunset. He had actually met Margaret and I as we came out of the field, and I had to stop her from screaming as he came lumbering up in about half his costume. The police took the phone, and the official report stated that some psycho had been creeping around, found us in the field, and decided to kill everyone but Margaret and I for some reason. Dad forbade me from doing anything like that in the field again, and I agreed, pretty done with anything related to the Corn Man after that. A couple of days later, after I'd been asked about 1,000 questions by the police, Margaret came to sit with me at lunch. "Thank you," she said, and I was a little confused as to what she was thanking me for. "For? My mom got the call today. They have to run a bunch of new tests, but the cancer's gone. She had a tumor in her brain about the size of my thumb, and it's just gone." We sat in silence after that, neither of us saying it, but both of us thinking the same thing. It would appear that Margaret had gotten her wish from the Corn Man after all. "You see him?" Clancy asked Roger. The two of them crouched behind the fence. "Shut up, or he's going to hear us," Roger hissed, pressing his eye to the splintery wood. It was after sunset, and if their mothers realized they weren't home yet, the boys would be in big trouble. They didn't care, though. They wanted to look at this mysterious fella who lived in the creepy old house at the end of the block. The one who only came out after dark. Thomas Baldhu was known to almost everyone in Chambliss. It was a small town, a town built on coal and lumber, and the population was roughly 20,000. As such, the large and foreboding house at the end of Fortner Lane stood out like a sore thumb. In a town of mostly trailers and ranch homes, the house in question was Baldhu Place, and it loomed like a gargoyle at the end of the cul-de-sac. No one knew how long it had been there, but some of the kids had seen a picture of the old manor in old paintings from the early days of the town. They say it had been occupied by the town's founder, and when he'd been arrested after a string of children had gone missing, someone new had taken up residence there. Someone who only came out after dark. The mob hadn't waited for justice to be served, it was said. They had dragged Thomas from his cell and beheaded him in the street, something that was the custom in certain places. Afterwards, the townspeople had wanted to go and see what sort of things the town founder had in his now empty home. But when the lights kept coming on and strange figures were seen around the grounds, they thought the magnificent manor might be haunted. They assumed it would eventually fall to pieces without someone to take care of it, but instead, the house remained, and even seemed to thrive under the care of whoever owned it. People had seen a shadowy figure making changes to the home for years, maintaining the grounds and fixing the damage to the ancient three-story, but no one had ever met him. That was 100 years ago, and as the town grew, the house remained as a mystery within Chambliss. No one in town still believed the house was haunted, but they knew someone was living there. Whoever they were extremely reclusive. When people came to the house, no one ever answered the door. If you approached the person while they were in the yard, they would always retreat inside. No one knew who they were or what relation they might be to the old founder. But they did know one thing about the owner of the house, and that was that he loved Halloween. The owner of the house may not be social the other 364 days of the year, but on Halloween, they threw the gates open and passed out the choicest candies and the best tricks. As the boys watched, the yard was already being prepared for the coming holiday. The front porch was festooned with pumpkins. The yard was set with gravestones and half-buried caskets, and the cobwebs and bats were thick in every tree. The trees in the yard always looked skeletal, despite how much attention was paid to the lawn, and they added to the aesthetic of the home. No one could be sure, but everyone was pretty sure the creepy nature of the homestead was intentional. The wood was dark, painted a deep brown, and stained like dark chocolate. The windows always glowed with something like candlelight, and the house just seemed to lean malevolently. Beyond those gates, it was Halloween every day for whoever happened to live there. "What's he doing?" Clancy asked. The crack he was peeking through wasn't very wide, and Roger had the better vantage point with the knothole. "He's filling orange bags with leaves for yard jack-o'-lanterns." "How does he see?" Clancy asked, the scritch-scratch of the man's rake constant as he collected up his medium. "Dunno. He doesn't even have the porch light on. Maybe he's raking by pumpkin light." Clancy wanted to look up over the fence, but he didn't dare. Both boys assumed the man would just leave if he thought they were watching, but you could never be sure. When Clancy's mother called his name, the boys stiffened like a goose had walked over their graves. They could see the person in the yard stiffen too, looking in the direction of the call as he turned to the fence. In the gathering shadows, they could see that he was dressed in jeans and a sweater, clothes that would look as acceptable for yard work as they would for a homeless man. The garments hung off of him, his body thin and emaciated, and people in town thought he might be sick. His voice, however, did not match his appearance. The voice everyone heard when they did business with him was rich, cultured, and full of vigor. Many of the women secretly held affection for him, saying his voice sounded like one of the men from the romance novel covers they all read, while their husbands were at work, of course. They would have to imagine what his face might look like, though, because he never came into town. He would call the local businesses and tell them he needed supplies delivered to the house about twice a year. Wood, decorations, candy, various and sundry things that he used to fix up the house or to get ready for the holidays. He never called the grocer or the butcher, however, and people weren't sure what he was eating up there. Whatever it was, it kept him going, and he continued to tirelessly work on the house and the grounds by moonlight. "Roger!" came the shrill cry from farther down the block. "Roger, it's past curfew, boy. You'd better get home before your dinner gets cold." "Crap," Roger said, taking his eyes off the yard as he turned back towards the house. "She sounds mad." "We better go," Clancy whispered, feeling very exposed by the pool of illumination from the streetlight overhead. "Yeah, might be a... Are you boys quite all right?" said a cultured voice from behind them. Both boys jumped like someone had lashed them with a belt. They looked back, shaking as the shadow of the stranger fell across them. In the gloom of the yard, he had appeared to be a large, thin man, but now he loomed over the boys like a giant from a fable. Both had barely gotten a good look at the stranger before the lamp overhead popped, and left them standing in the gathering darkness. Both yelled in terror, scrambling away from the fence as they beat feet up the street for home, as startled by the lamp as the man. He watched them go, his face obscured by the gloom, except for his eyes. Both boys would swear later that they had seen 2 red flickers where his eyes should be. Both boys would also swear that his head had been a grinning skull until the day they died. "It was probably just a mask, Roger," Clancy said as they walked to school the next day. He could still feel the sting his dad had put into his bottom for being out past dark, and his mother had scolded him for bothering the nice man who lived at Baldhu Place. "He's never hurt anyone, and he'll never feel like he can introduce himself to the neighborhood if you kids keep bothering him." She had colored a little as she said it, and some of the snap in his father's hand could have been because he'd noticed. Many of the men in town were hoping that the mysterious man would stay in his house and leave their wives to their daydreams. "Mask nothing," Roger said. "That was a skull with 2 red eyes. You and I both saw it." "I don't know," Clancy hedged, not wanting another whipping from his dad for bothering people. His dad had been passed up for another promotion at the paper mill, and he was ornery these days. His mom had tried to console him, saying he'd get it next time, but he'd been sitting in the den with a case of beer in a foul mood lately. "What I know is that someone with a skeleton for a head is living in our town, and we should let people know about it." "Yeah?" Clancy said skeptically. "How are we going to do that? Mr. Baldhu never comes out or lets people see him, so how are we going to do anything?" "Just so happens we don't need him to come out. In 2 nights, Mr. Baldhu will open his gates and let kids in to trick-or-treat. He always has a spooky display where he hides so he can give people a good scare. If we can get close, we can snap a picture and get proof. You still got that instant camera?" Clancy nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, but if I break it running away, my mom will literally kill me. It was a Christmas present." "We won't break it," Roger assured him. "Once we get proof, we'll be heroes. Imagine how cool we'll be if we snap a picture of the ghost that haunts Baldhu Place." Clancy thought about it, and as he thought of the kids at school chanting his name, he decided that it might be worth the risk. He and Roger would be legends, and a reputation like that could take them all the way to middle school. "What's your costume this year?" Roger asked, though it sounded like it didn't matter. "I got a cardboard box robot that I made last year," Clancy said. His dad had helped him make it last year, back when he was in a better mood, and Clancy had added a little more spray paint the following week. That had earned him a loud scolding from his dad, too. Apparently he had used the good spray paint, and not the cheap crap that he had bought for him last year. Clancy had said he was sorry, and finished up with the other can. It looked good now, and the thought that he might not wear it made him feel a little sad. It would surely be too small next year. "I got another ninja costume from my grandma. She gave it to me for my birthday last year. Mom bought me a new one without thinking about it, and if we go as ninjas, we can make a hasty retreat once we get the picture." The logic was sound to Clancy. Ninjas would be faster than a clunky box robot, and he agreed to meet at Roger's house on Friday night. "Bring your camera, and don't be late. I want to hit a few houses before we get to the big prize." It was edging up on 9 o'clock when the boys got to the gates of the Baldhu Place. A few houses had turned into a 3-hour tour of 6 different neighborhoods, and when Roger realized what time it was, he'd said a word that would have made Clancy's mom wash his mouth out with soap. The boys had run back to their neighborhood and left their candy at Roger's house before heading out again. Roger's mom had asked if they didn't have enough candy, but Roger said they had one more house to hit before they packed it in. "We got to get candy from the Baldhu Place. He always has the best treats in town." She had told them to be quick, and the 2 ninjas had headed back into the night. Now that they were standing here before the lair of the beast, Clancy was feeling a little unsure of the plan. Let's just go back, Roger. We've got enough candy. We don't really need to." But Roger stepped into the yard like he hadn't even heard him. Roger intended to get his treat this year. Clancy was left with no choice but to turn around or follow after, and his loyalty to his friend was too great to back out now. The yard was set up like a graveyard, and as they walked towards the house, Clancy jumped as a zombie lurched out of a coffin that had been set up next to the gate. He growled and roared before descending back down again to get ready for the next victim. Roger laughed as the kid in the ghost costume jumped in time with Clancy, glancing around to make sure that he was the last before proceeding. It was late now, and the boys were the last two left on the property. If they were going to make their move, now would be the time. They made their way up the sidewalk, graves erupting to reveal zombies or skeletons that popped out with a mechanical growling noise. He was really going all out this year, it seemed, and the boys expected a grave to contain the mysterious Mr. Baldhu at any minute. He would come stomping out, dressed as a skeleton or a zombie, and they could trick him into bending down so they could snatch his mask and reveal his face. Clancy was ready with his camera, and Roger had seen him snap several panic shots as they went. The closer they got to the house without encountering him, the more their nerves jangled. With every crackly mechanical growl and yowl that split the air, the boys' trepidation rose, and as they mounted the stairs to the house, they felt a cold chill run up their backs. They had come midway when the door to the house opened, revealing a rocking chair with a headless body seated in it. It held a bucket of candy in its lap, the chair creaking menacingly with every sway of the occupant. "Get the camera ready," Roger whispered, sneaking up to the chair. Clancy nodded, standing just inside the door as he tried to stop his knees from shaking. Roger came up to the bowl, his eyes boring into the headless thing as he reached into the mound of candy. He expected the jump, expected the scare, but he never expected the direction it might come from. Clancy watched through the little window, hands shaking as he waited to snap the picture. All at once, Roger shot his free hand for where the head should be on the rocker, trying to find its head. Should be right below the neckline, an easy grab, but as Roger patted the spot, he found it solid, crying out in pain as something took hold of his rooting hand. He had been so intent on the shoulders, he hadn't bothered to take his hand out of the candy bowl. Now, something had a hold of it, and Roger was afraid it would tear it off. "Clancy! Clancy, help me!" he yelled, but the door slammed shut then, sealing their fate. As the man stood up, Roger pulled his hand free of the bowl, and Clancy screamed in terror as the bloody skull chomped happily at it. It was an old skull, the bones red with blood, and the teeth were turning red as Roger's fingers were ground beneath them. Roger shook it only once, the pain too great to have it move much, and when the meaty snap washed over the boys, the skull hit the ground with nearly half the finger still in his mouth. Roger fled, pounding on the door as Clancy sputtered and cried for someone to help them. His camera flashed a few more times, but what it caught was anyone's guess. When the body bent down to get the head, tucking it under its arm, the skull seemed to tut as it worried down the finger into its non-existent throat. "Terribly sorry, boys. I know it's bad manners and a touch barbaric, but Bloody Bones here does love his treats on Halloween. I've had to limit him. Missing children do make such a fuss. But," the skull said, as its bones turned up abnormally, "Halloween is such a hectic time. Sometimes children go missing for one reason or another." The boys cowered as he came towards them, but their screams fell on deaf ears as Bloody Bones and Rawhead went about their business. The boys were searched for, but never found. The police came and searched Baldhu Place, but they never found the boys or its mysterious owner. Baldhu Place continues to stand to this day, and every Halloween there's a grand event with candy and decorations. Supplies are still delivered, the bills are always paid, and children sometimes go missing. No one could know that when the townspeople beheaded Thomas Baldhu, they would create a legacy that would outlast even the town. None of them could have known what they created with the swipe of a simple axe, or how it would haunt the town forevermore. It was my first Halloween on Hambry Street, and I was raring to go. I had just moved to the neighborhood the week before, and I was hoping to meet some of the kids on the street as I filled my bag with treats. Mom hadn't set out to move this close to Halloween, but when your dad decides he needs his house for his mistress and her kids, you have to pick up and go pretty quickly. The court had made him buy Mom out of her half of the house, but that wasn't too difficult for him. We'd found a very nice house on Hambry Street, a street packed with families and little crackerbox houses, but unpacking hadn't left a lot of time to make friends. Now, standing on the front stoop in my homemade ghost costume, I was ready to find some friends. The costume had been last minute. My mom had honestly forgotten about it in the move, and when I had reminded her an hour ago, she had realized that there was no time to buy one. Hunting around, she found some old sheets and cut a couple of eye holes in one to make a classic ghost costume. It looked kinda lame next to the superheroes and cartoon characters that were tromping up and down the street, but I liked it. It reminded me of Charlie Brown from the storybook I had on my bookcase, and as I set out, I wondered if someone might actually give me a rock. I didn't get a rock, but I did get a lot of looks from those around me. I had expected some laughs, maybe some questions about why I didn't have a real costume, but what I got was something between fear and scorn. People stepped out of my way. The adults looked down at me with disbelief, and a lot of the kids looked scared. I had to look at the front of the sheet a couple of times to make sure they weren't stained or something. No one wanted to talk to me. Most of the kids turned away from me, and the people at the houses refused to give me candy. They slammed the door in my face almost immediately, some of them telling me that I should be ashamed of myself before doing it. That's how I came to be sitting on the sidewalk, trying not to cry, and wondering why I had bothered to come out at all. I'd met no one, I had made 0 friends, and I felt like I should have just gone home an hour ago. So when the group of other kids in ghost costumes walked down the street, they were pretty easy to spot. There were 5 of them, their ghost costumes looking dirty and ragged, and as they walked like a line of spooky ducklings, the crowd parted for them as well. They didn't stop at any of the houses, they didn't speak to anyone, they just kept making their way up the street like an arrow fired from a bow. I felt drawn to follow them for some reason, and to this day I can't say why. Maybe I felt some kind of kinship, maybe it was the way people treated them, but regardless, I got up and ran to catch them, my shoes slapping on the concrete as I went. The other kids watched me go with genuine concern, but I didn't much care. These kids seemed to have made the same mistake I had, and it seemed like it was better to be an outcast as a group than alone. "Hey, wait up!" I called, the 5 ghosts utterly ignoring me as they went along. We walked in our now 6-ghost line, and I began attempting to make conversation with them. They looked to be about my age, or at least my height, and they all carried brightly colored candy bags that were in the same sorry state as their costumes. They were mud-spattered, ripped in places, and the kid in front had shoes with the soles nearly coming off. His left sole slapped on the pavement, going whap, 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 and I wondered what sort of costumes these were. Were they some kind of zombie ghosts or something? Next to my clean white sheet, they looked downright grimy, and I wondered why their parents had let them leave the house like this. "Where are we going?" I finally asked, all of them leaving my neighborhood as we turned a corner and headed into a less crowded street. I promised my mom I wouldn't go too far, and I don't know the streets real well. They ignored me, but I wouldn't have long to wonder. I had seen the house before. Mom and I stared at it as we'd driven into town. It stood out, the grass long, the fence ragged, but the house was the centerpiece of the unkempt space. It had probably once been a very nice one-story house, but it looked like someone had pelted it with eggs or dirt, or both, and the owner just hadn't bothered to clean it off. The windows were boarded up, the shingles hung raggedly from the roof, and someone had spray-painted "Killer" across the garage door in big red letters. It was impossible not to notice, and I realized too late that this was our destination. Are we trick-or-treating here? I don't even think anyone lives here. They didn't say anything, but I realized I was wrong a few minutes later. I could see a light peeking from a crack in one of the boarded-up windows, and as the ghosts arrived on the sidewalk, it was suddenly covered by a shadow. The ghosts did not approach the house. They didn't even come off the sidewalk. They just stood there, bags in hand, and stared at the house. The shadow moved away from the opening a few times, but it always came back in short order. It was a fitful thing, moving away only to come back quicker and quicker to check that the ghosts were still there. I kept turning to look at them, asking what we were doing, and receiving no answer. The ghost kids just stood and stared, boring into the house with their dark circle eyes, and I think that was when I really got a good look at them. Their sheets weren't just grimy, they were covered in mud tracks. Some of the stains looked like they could be blood, but the worst was the bare stretch of leg beneath the sheets. The skin on those legs was cut and bleeding, purple and bruised, and the arms were in a similar state of abuse. The eyes, though, the eyes were the worst. Looking out from the open holes were dark eyes that were purple with rings. The kids looked like they had gone 10 rounds with a professional boxer, and the part that usually had color was pitch black and unblinking. These kids weren't interested in candy. They were out for something else. I had opened my mouth to ask them why we were just standing here, when the door suddenly opened, and a man in dirty, sweat-stained clothes came weaving out. He wore sweatpants and a tank top, and his bare feet looked like he had bumped them enough times to break every toe on them. He was thin to the point of being skeletal, and the clothes hung off him like rags. I had worried at first that he might be drunk, weaving and pivoting across the yard, but the closer he got, the more I understood that he was stone sober. He wasn't stumbling. He was afraid, and it took everything he had to approach the ghost kids. "What do you want?" he stammered, his foot catching on something in the tall grass. "Why do you torment me?" The grass was so tall that you could hear the dry husks scraping against his pants. But if it bothered him, or the 5 other little ghosts, it never showed. "Haven't I suffered enough? The town won't let me forget. My ex-wife won't let me forget. And now you return every Halloween to remind me of my mistake. Why? Why? Just leave me alone. Haven't I suffered enough?" He stumbled again, his foot catching hard this time, and when he bumped into me, he barely missed knocking me down. That's when he seemed to realize that I was something else. He looked at me in disbelief, but it quickly turned to rage. He lunged forward, grabbing me and shaking me as I tried to articulate something, anything, that would make him stop. He was hurting me, my head snapping back and forth as he shook, and I couldn't make a sound as he tried to shake me to death. You aren't one of them. There were only 5 of them. There's always been 5 of them. Why are you here? Why are you tormenting me? Why are you—" Something hit him in the face, and he fell back into the grass and clutched his cheek. Something wet and sticky rolled down his neck, and I had a moment of fear as I wondered if it might be his eye. It wasn't. I saw that when he pulled his hand away. But when the second one hit him, I saw it was an egg, as a third and a fourth joined it. "Get off him, you killer! Haven't you killed enough kids already?" I turned to see 3 kids on the opposite sidewalk, a carton of eggs between their feet, and their hands already throwing more. The man scuttled backwards, shielding his face as he went and disappeared into the grass, more eggs pelting in on him. I heard the crunch of old weeds that was followed by the slam of a door, and when I heard sneakers coming up towards me, I put a hand up in case the eggs came flying my way. "You okay, kid?" I looked up to find a Power Ranger, the red one, extending a hand to help me up. That was Ryan, someone who would later become my best friend over the next few days. Yeah, I said, accepting the hand up. I looked over at where the other ghosts had been, but they were all gone. I suppose they had gotten what they came for. "Whoa, let me help you with that," he said, taking the sheet off and folding it a little as he draped it around me. After a few minutes of fussing with it, his friends coming over to help, he had made a halfway decent toga out of it. His friends, soon to be my friends too, Rob and Patrick, agreed that it looked a lot better, though it clashed with their Power Ranger costumes badly. "You're that kid that just moved in on Hamby, right?" Ryan asked. "I'm Ryan. This is Patrick and Robert." "Just Rob," he insisted as he waved. They invited me to come with them, chucking another dozen or so eggs at the house that the man had scuttled back into. They didn't seem angry about it. They did it like it was an expected chore, and almost seemed bored. They left the trash in the yard before picking up their bikes and walking back the way I'd come, towards the happy sound of our active street. Why did you guys throw eggs at that house anyway?" I asked, the 4 of us passing more kids on their way with eggs. Did he do something to you?" I had expected them to laugh or maybe act proud of what they had done, but they just shrugged. It was a look you sometimes saw on people who were voting or going about volunteer work, bored but certain of their actions, and it was something that was hard to make sense of at the age of 10. "We egg his house every year. Everybody does. No one likes Horace Jenkins, but especially not on Halloween." "Why?" I asked, still confused. "Same reason I bet no one has given you candy. No one wears ghost costumes either. Not after what he did." "But what did he do?" I said, starting to get aggravated. Ryan turned like he was going to yell at me for being stupid, but seemed to remember that I was new. "It was probably about 15 years ago, way before we were born. Horace Jenkins was the owner of some company, something that was doing well around here, but it didn't make people like him. Horace Jenkins, from what my dad says, was a mean man. He didn't treat people right. He was rude. He didn't support the community. But he was rich, so people let him stay. On Halloween night, about 15 years ago, He was coming home drunk from some party he'd been at with his rich friends, and he ran over 5 kids in ghost costumes. It was all over the news. People knew he did it, but he got some hotshot lawyer who got him out of jail time. They claimed the kids had been running across the road. They claimed Horace hadn't actually been drunk, and they cast a lot of doubt and made a lot of deals. At least that's what Dad said. Afterwards, Horace tried to pay the families off, but they wouldn't take his money. No one in town would take his money. No one would work for his company. And he lost all his money when his wife left him. She took the house, his cars, his kids, and he was left with that little house and not much else. The people here let him live in that house, but they let him know that we haven't forgotten. After the incident, it was considered kind of disrespectful to wear ghost costumes anymore. That's why no one does it. They didn't know you were the new kid on the block. They just thought you were being mean. Now you know better. Eh, Caesar? Caesar became my nickname after that, and my makeshift toga got me a lot of candy before the streetlights went out. I spent some time afterward trading candy with my new friends and promising to see them at school the next day. I still live in that town, some 20 years later, and it's still considered a tradition to go egg Horace Jenkins' house. He's still alive, an old codger of 79, and I've realized that the town keeps him around as a warning. Working for the bank, I've come to find out that Horace Jenkins has no money, no assets, not a penny to his name, but his taxes are paid, his power and water bills paid, and food is left on his doorstep once a week to sustain him. It's nothing gourmet, the basics are good enough for him, but it keeps him alive and living in a house that is slowly rotting around him. Once a year, someone cuts the grass. Once a year, someone spray paints killer on his garage door. Once a year, we all throw eggs and dirt clods at his house to remind him that he tried to cheat his way out of 5 lives. The law may have exonerated him, but the town does not forget, and it doesn't forgive. Sometimes, while my friends and I throw our eggs at the sagging wreck, I think I see 5 little ghosts on the sidewalk, staring at the house of the man who murdered them. Sometimes, while I throw my eggs at that temple of hatred, I wish Horace Jenkins would live 1,000 years. Then I remember those ghost kids will be waiting for him, and that brings me some comfort. Jeffry hated jack-o'-lanterns. This was a problem, since his hometown was known as the jack-o'-lantern capital of the United States. Every year, the town was host to thousands, if not millions, of carved horrors. It had become a point of pride for their Midwestern town. The town had been full of pumpkins since its founding back in the 1800s, and the town was filled with glowing, grinning gourds from September till April. The public commons had 3 large greenhouses that grew pumpkins during the cold months, and no citizen had to pay for one of those pumpkins. Jeffry was pretty sure it came out of their taxes, along with road works and the police force. Jeffry had grown up carving, eating, and hating pumpkins with a red-hot fury. As a child, the glowing gourds had frightened him. His parents were never sure why, but he was terrified of them. Until he was 7, Jeffry had refused to even carve one, and he remembered getting into some trouble several times for pushing them off the porch. It never stopped a new one from appearing where the old one had been, but it always came with a stern talking to about wasting pumpkins. Pumpkins were a hot commodity in the town, and were not something to be squandered. By the time he was 17, his fear had turned into a deep hatred. A hatred that had brought him to this moment. Jeffry was sitting on the commons with his friends when he got an idea. Hey, what if we pulled a prank on Halloween? Like, a big one. Chris looked up, cigarette smoke curling over his face, while Chris leaned over his handlebars and grinned stupidly at Jeffry. What kind of prank? Chris asked, cigarette hanging from his mouth like a modern-day cowboy. Chris was your typical greasy teenage troublemaker. He was decked out in a leather jacket, ripped jeans, black boots, and a constant need to smoke the cigarettes he usually lifted from his dad. Chris likely considered himself some kind of badass, and Jeffrey had seen him make good on enough of the idle threats he made to agree with him. Despite this, Chris was the most stable of Jeffrey's friends, and he made quite the contrast to the grinning idiot leaning on his handlebars. Something big, something they'll never forget, Jeffrey said, grinning hugely. Jeffrey was watching them unload a wagon of pumpkins from the greenhouse as they loitered on the commons. Jeffrey wanted nothing so much as to watch them all become compost. Like, maybe some soap in the fountain again? Kevin suggested. Kevin was the polar opposite of Chris. If Chris looked like a greaser, Kevin looked like a generic Chad. Blonde hair, blue eyes, tap-out t-shirt, gold chains, wind pants, and lots of pictures on his phone of his well-crafted physique. Kevin and Chris had been Jeffrey's friends for a long time, but the truth was that he mostly just used them as muscle. He wanted them in case things went south, and something like this had the potential to go very wrong very quickly. No, Kevin, something a little bigger this time. I'm thinking about smashing some pumpkins on Halloween night. Kevin grinned, but Chris raised a pierced eyebrow at him. Are you kidding? You know how anal this town is about those damn pumpkins. If we go around people's houses and smash up their jack-o'-lanterns. No, I'm not just talking about the ones on people's houses. I want to smash all the pumpkins. The ones at the houses, the ones at the shops, and the displays on the commons, too. The two of them looked at him in stunned silence. By morning, I don't want a single jack-o'-lantern in the whole town unpulped. Kevin grinned like a shot fox, nodding his head and raising his hand for a high five. Jeffrey obliged him, holding his hand up to Chris next. Chris didn't say anything, though. His lips were slowly creeping into a distinctive evil grin as he thought about the implications, and he slapped his own palm against Jeffrey's at long last. Chris was smart, probably smarter than anyone Jeffrey knew, but he loved a good trick as much as anyone. The idea of all the townspeople seeing their pumpkins smashed, their town pride destroyed, made him feel like the Grinch at the end of the movie, sans the change of heart, of course. We'll be legends, more than legends. We'll be infamous, Chris said as he pulled his hand into a raised fist. Jeffrey laughed. Boys, I guarantee that the day after Halloween will go down in town history when we're done. As they sat on the commons and started to flesh out their plans, Jeffrey had no idea how right he was. They stood in Jeffrey's garage later that day and made plans. Halloween was 5 days away, and they had to make sure that they could commit their prank and get away with it unscathed. Being arrested for a stunt like this would only elevate their street cred, but Jeffrey was honestly a little worried about how the town would take what they were getting ready to do. As the three rode through town to get to Jeffrey's house, they passed through the downtown and saw the shops littered with pumpkins. The plaque that commemorated when the world's largest pumpkin had come through town with the fair one year showed resplendently on the front lawn of the town hall. The display table of pumpkins outside Jack-O-Lantern's museum made the table sag under their orange mass. Jeffrey thought once again how vital the stupid things were to the town. They would get in real trouble for this, so the first order of business would be masks. They'll need to be full face too, Chris put in when Jeffrey brought it up. I don't want them seeing our hair, our noses, and identifying us somehow. Kevin laughed. Easy. My bro and I are heading to Seaver Friday night. You guys slide me some cash for masks, and I'll bring back some quality stuff. Jeffrey looked at Chris, and he looked back at him. This was a big ask from Kevin, a guy who still got lost on his way to school sometimes. Kevin's role in the gang was muscle, that was obvious, and trusting him with something like this was a stretch. If he got distracted when he and his bro got to Seaver, they could be out of money and have no masks for this caper. Chris was right when he said full face mask would be a must, and the shops in town wouldn't have what they were looking for. Kevin must have noticed the look, because he got a little frustrated. Oh, come on, guys, I can do this. Do you want good masks or not? Chris shrugged at Jeffrey, who sighed as he took out his wallet and handed Kevin a 20. Kevin looked at Chris, opening and closing his hand as he crumpled Jeffrey's 20 in his grip. Chris dropped his motorcycle boots off the table and rolled his eyes, pulling out a 20 of his own and adding it to the pile. Kevin reached into his wind pants and took out a 20 of his own, adding it to the pile before pushing the whole wad into his pocket. They were taking a big chance on Kevin, and both made sure he damn well knew it. The next 5 days were agony for Jeffrey. He couldn't tell anyone what they were planning to do. That would ruin the prank, but they still had to make sure they had an alibi. Providence threw them a bone on that one because their friend Mark was having a Halloween party that night. One RSVP later, and they made the party part of their plans. People would see them, they would remember that they had been there, and Jeffrey and his friends could sneak out at 9:30 and be back home before any of the booze-soaked brains had time to miss them. It was the perfect plan, and promised to give the boys maximum deniability if questioned. Even so, Jeffrey didn't sleep well that week. He was plagued with dreams that he would stagger awake from and fall back into as soon as he closed his eyes. Jeffrey saw himself smashing jack-o'-lantern after jack-o'-lantern, a deep fog surrounding everything as he moved from gourd to gourd. All the while, something watched him from that haze. Jeffrey couldn't see it, but it was big. Its red eyes seemed pleased at what he was doing. Now and again, Jeffrey would raise his bat and salute to the mysterious figure, and it would rear back and cackle like a demon. These dreams terrified him, but Jeffrey always woke up feeling elated at the regard of this creature. The three seemed to plan constantly that week. They would use their bikes as transportation. Jeffrey figured their bikes would cut around with less notice than a car, and they would be faster than on foot. He figured they would have about an hour and a half tops to pull this off before the devastation was noticed, and speed would be critical to the operation. Kevin had some baseball bats in the shed that they planned to use, and the three of them began to map their route. As long as Kevin got the masks, they'd be home free. He winked at them Friday afternoon as his brother came to pick him up from school. "Don't forget," Jeffrey reminded him. "I've got this, guys," Kevin scoffed, hopping into the Jeep as the two peeled out for Seaver. Chris and Jeffrey parted ways then, hoping against hope that they would have the last pieces of the puzzle soon. Chris sent him a text later that night saying, "I still haven't heard from Kevin." Jeffrey sighed as he buried his face against the pillow. Kevin had better not mess this up. Chris came over the following day and found Jeffrey in the garage. He was oiling the chain on his bike when Chris pulled up. He was preparing for tonight, and Chris looked put out. Jeffrey could guess the source of his anger. Kevin had been radio silent since yesterday at school. Not a text, not a call, not anything. He forgot, and you know it," Chris said. "We don't know that," Jeffrey said, trying to remain positive. Though brilliant, Chris could be volatile and was prone to moodiness sometimes. Jeffrey didn't want him bailing out at the last minute. "He won't return my text, and his phone goes straight to voicemail. If he and his brother spent the night in Seaver, we could be screwed." Jeffrey started to speak, but at that moment, a familiar Jeep pulled up in his driveway. Kevin leaned in to say something to his brother, before taking a brown paper sack from the back seat as the Jeep drove off and Kevin approached the pair. He was all smiles, not reading the room at all, and when Chris walked towards him, he spread his arms out as he prepared to wrap him in one of his annoying bro hugs. When Chris socked him in the gut instead, Kevin's grin faded as he groaned and fell to his knees. Jeffrey pulled him back, but Kevin took it in strides as Jeffrey tried to pull the greaser away from him. "What was that for?" Kevin gasped, not really hurt, but definitely startled. "That is for bugging out and going radio silent for the last 24 hours. I dropped my phone in a puddle about 5 minutes after we got there. I didn't realize you two were so worried about me." Chris balled up his fists, straining against Jeffrey as he tried to hit Kevin again. Jeffrey pushed the greaser into a nearby recliner, kicking up a cloud of dust as he tried to settle Chris. "No worries, as long as you got the masks," Jeffrey said, still not holding out hope for this scatterbrained musclehead. Kevin's grin threatened to cut his head in half. "Oh, I got the masks. I think you'll find them very fitting, too." Jeffrey took the bag from Kevin, feeling the thick rubber masks inside the plain grocery bag. He reached in and pulled out a ghoulish orange mask that made him grin as wide as Kevin. The plastic thing looked like a demented jack-o'-lantern, its gaping black mouth cut into a frightening double row of teeth. Its black eyes were angled with malice, and Jeffrey could see a few plastic roaches crawling up the nostrils as he took it in. It was perfect. Jeffrey couldn't believe that Kevin had picked this out. It would be fitting to attack the town's established idols with their very likeness adorning their faces. He tossed a second mask to Chris, and the greaser goggled like a fool as he took in the ghoulish thing. Jeffrey could feel a lot of the anxiety melting away, and when he raised his hand this time, It was to give Kevin a hearty high five. "Kev, these are perfect." "You act like I would bring you anything less," Kevin said, with no small amount of swagger. Jeffrey pulled the mask on, feeling the plastic set on his face like a second skin. "Tonight, we're gonna make history." As the sun began to set and the trick-or-treaters started to gather on the sidewalk, the three set off on their bikes. They had their bats and their masks stored in their backpack, along with the required 6-pack of beer to get into the party. They had dressed darkly in black pants and hoodies, and they were prepared to ride the streets like phantoms after dark. They arrived at Mark's party about 7, the festivities already in full swing. It was a typical high school underage drinking party. Lots of people making out in the living room, a collective of smoke clouds around the back and the front porch, people dancing around to loud music, and a kitchen that was 5 parts wet bar and 5 parts buffet. Mark's parents were out of town. They always seemed to be out of town, and Mark's house was typically the place where parties happened. The three stood around and sipped warm beer, keeping an eye on their watches, their nerves tuned up to 1,000,000,000. They didn't want to be there too long, just long enough to get noticed. They would say hi to some people from school, play a few rounds of beer pong, and at 9:45 they would slip out and take their bikes off quietly. They had been going over their individual routes for days. Chris would take 5th through 6th Street, Kevin would take 7th through 10th Street, and Jeffrey would take 11th through 15th Street. There were roughly 5 to 10 houses per street, and everyone would meet up downtown when they were done. If someone got done early, they would start smashing pumpkins downtown and wait for the others. If the cops came, they would run. The person discovered would lead them away so the others could keep smashing, and then meet back up when they lost them. They would not assume the vandals were organized. They would think they were holiday pranksters out for fun, and if they grabbed one of them, the other two could finish the night's work before anyone was the wiser. When Jeffrey's watch jangled to let them know it was 9:45, the three of them snuck out the back and rode off into the night. They split off at 10 o'clock. The front porch is dark, save for the glow of the jacks, and the streets were mostly free of trick-or-treaters. Jeffrey slipped on his mask as he came to 11th Street, grinning beneath it as he pulled his bat out. The first gourd he hit exploded in a shower of orange skin and wet innards. He smiled beneath the mask, smashing the other two and moving on to the next. The pumpkins were old by now, starting to rot, and his bat made quick work of them. Jeffrey had finished with the street in no time, his arm burning from the effort, but his desire for more burning hotter still. He had seen people peeking from their windows, but no blue and whites coming to chase him away. The work seemed too easy. The jack-o'-lanterns flew apart with a single swing of the bat, and Jeffrey reveled in the feel of his anger and fear being satiated. He would look back on that feeling throughout his years and feel deep shame, but tonight it was all about his revenge on the source of his terror. Jeffrey was not challenged until 12th Street. He had gotten cocky halfway through his culling. He wasn't content to just smash the pumpkins anymore. Oh no. Jeffrey had started throwing them against trees, mailboxes, and the houses that set silent guardians over them. No one came out to challenge him, their love for their pumpkins going only so far, and Jeffrey felt untouchable as he shattered his latest gourd against the door of 3608 12th Street. When the man lumbered from beside the porch, laying hands on Jeffrey as the boy grabbed for another pumpkin, Jeffrey was terrified for half a second. The mask had become turned in his effort, and he hadn't seen the man as he started sneaking around. The light was poor, but Jeffrey was pretty sure it was Mr. Bask, his English teacher. He was standing in his bathrobe and asking Jeffrey just what the hell he thought he was doing as he tried to wrestle the last of his pumpkins from him. Jeffrey had a short and squishy tug-of-war with Mr. Bask, and finally had the bright idea to just let the hateful gourd go. Jeffrey's fingers had started to slide through the thin skin at the pumpkin's base anyway, and the last thing he wanted was slime all over his hands. The old man stumbled backwards as Jeffrey released his hold and fell on his backside as the pumpkin splattered against him, covering him in soupy guts and rotten seeds. He looked at Jeffrey for a moment, so lost and afraid of this pumpkin demon who had visited his wrath on his home, and for a moment, Jeffrey came to his senses. He started towards him, wanting to help him up, but then the shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find a true demon standing on the sidewalk. He was standing in the shadow of a giant inflatable pumpkin, and the street light seemed loath to touch him. He was massive, a huge shadowed figure of steel and green. When he sliced the inflatable pumpkin with his axe or sword or whatever he carried, it sputtered in death as it puddled on the lawn. Jeffry was frozen by him for a moment, his terror and anger at the pumpkins paling compared to his madness at the sight of this creature. Then it spoke, the voice of winter, and he was once again filled with that potent fire. "To hell with him! Your work must be fulfilled!" Jeffry nodded, mounting his bike and riding off without a second glance at the prone man he'd left behind. By the time Jeffry finished his work, it was nearly midnight. He had taken so long. How had he taken so long? He had been so taken by the act of destruction that Jeffry had lost track of time. He was surprised that no one else had come out to challenge him, and wondered how no one had called the police yet. Jeffry's clothes were splattered with pumpkin, his mask caked with dried seeds and goopy rind, but he didn't feel tired in the least bit. Quite the contrary, Jeffry felt an almost maniacal need to see more pumpkins squashed beneath his bat. He rode downtown, feeling the cold breeze drive him forward, the chill stroking the blaze of his revenge. The fell breeze felt like oncoming winter, and it seemed to lend Jeffry its power. As Jeffry rode into downtown, he passed the remains of many smashed jack-o'-lanterns on the way. Chris and Kevin had been busy, it would seem. Tables had been overturned, and the gaping holes from the pumpkins greeted him as he rode. They had thrown them in the street, smashed windows on the storefronts, and scattered the guts of numerous gourds everywhere. If Jeffry had been in his right mind, he would have doubtlessly seen this as a little too much. They hadn't agreed to this level of vandalism, nothing even close to this magnitude, but at that moment, Jeffry was emboldened by the sight of such destruction. This was his will, so Jeffry thought, and he would reward them for their efforts. Jeffry felt the mist gathering over the town as much as he saw it. Its icy fingers were making chill bumps pop out on his arms, and he found himself looking for the figure on the sidewalk. Jeffry expected him to appear out of the mist and cackle, congratulating Jeffry for orchestrating such a fine bit of mischief, but if he was there, he was staying hidden for now. Jeffry found Kevin and Chris on the commons. It seemed that this was where the police had been. The cruiser's blue and white lights were cutting through the fog, but they couldn't hold a candle to the blaze that burned on the commons. Jeffry gawked at it, speechless at the towering bonfire the two had created. They had set the greenhouses on fire. They had set a pyre and called the police right to them. In his wonder and disbelief, though, Jeffry forgot to keep an eye peeled for trouble. Someone pushed him suddenly, spilling him into the street. They fell on him as he wrenched his arms painfully behind his back, and the fall had knocked the wind out of him. He didn't have the strength to fight them off, and when they lifted Jeffry to his feet, they shouted for him to stop resisting. Jeffry was shoved towards a strobing vehicle and pushed into the back seat. He shimmied to the other side, wanting to see if his friends would escape, but what Jeffry saw was far from what he had expected. Outside, Kevin and Chris were backing into the fog that swirled around the commons. The police were moving in, nightsticks in hand, and the cop that had cuffed Jeffry was moving up behind them as he yelled into his radio. He didn't seem to be reaching the person that he wanted, though, because Jeffry saw him jerk his head away as it crackled and sparked in his ear. He cursed and pulled it off, stomping on the box as it caught fire, and looked away from his fellow officers as he tried to put it out. That's why he didn't notice the figure that came riding out of the fog. But Jeffry saw him. He saw his red eyes first, glowing from high in the fog as he came up behind his friends. He was tall, nearly 10 feet, and Jeffry saw the two officers freeze as they noticed him. He came between Chris and Kevin, a single hoof stepping from the fog as his horse parted the mist. His armored form came next, his armor forest green, his horned helm the color of moss, his sword shrieking like a wildcat as he drew it out. Kevin and Chris didn't even look at him. Their pumpkin heads were still fixed on the officers. He was far more fantastic than Jeffry could have imagined. Neither his dream nor the phantom on the sidewalk had done him justice. And when he charged, the officers broke like quail. Jeffry heard him laugh, that bitter cackle that had haunted his dreams. When he sliced down the first officer, the man tried to impose his flimsy nightstick into the path of that vorpal blade. It sheared through the nightstick, the man's ballistic vest, and finally through his flesh. He fell to the ground in pieces, and the other 2 cops looked at the twitching pieces a little too long. The figure laid into them with gusto, and Jeffry jumped as a head bounced off the front glass and rested on the hood. The rider slew them all, rode them down like children, and when he rode towards the cruiser, Jeffry knew that he had arrived. The Green Man had returned. He leapt the car and rode into town, Chris and Kevin following mutely behind him. Jeffry pivoted in the seat, screaming for them to help him. He kicked the door, kicked the glass until it splintered into a cascade of spider webs. But the rider and his grotesque minions were already disappearing into the fog. They left him there with the bodies. They left him there to take the blame. Jeffry kicked until his legs ached. He screamed until his throat felt like it would break. He pulled on the cuffs until his wrists bled. In the end, though, it didn't matter in the slightest. More cops arrived as the mist dissipated. Jeffry was taken to jail, his mask removed, and his identity discovered. He was thrown in a jail cell, alone, while the cops tried to sort out the havoc that was going on around town. Calls were coming in from all over town. 17 more deaths were reported that night. Fires were blazing in several homes, broken sprinklers and fire hydrants that seemed to have frozen in the balmy October air, and too much vandalism to keep track of. Mark's party had been turned into a bloodbath, and the kids who had escaped were saying that it was a guy with a sword and 2 guys in pumpkin masks with bats. Through it all, Jeffry just sat in a dejected state in his cell. They had left him. He had been found unworthy, and now he would rot like one of those pumpkins he had shattered into so much useless paste. At some point, Jeffry must have dozed off, because when he returned to himself, the sheriff was leaning against the bars of his cell, sipping coffee from a styrofoam cup. "Good. You're awake." Jeffry said nothing. "Funny how everything seems to go to hell the second I decide to leave town for an evening. My granddaughter wanted me to take her trick-or-treating, so I drove to the next town over to oblige her, and come back to a whole mess of problems. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, son?" Jeffry said nothing. "Funny how you decided to smash up all the pumpkins. You know why the early citizens carved those pumpkins, don't you?" Jeffry continued saying nothing. "Sure you do. There's a mural in the museum. You've probably seen it 1,000 times, but never really thought much about it. The settlers that founded this place came fleeing something they didn't really understand, something they prayed they had left in the old country. That image on the mural of the tide riding down on us, that's not English invaders as we sometimes pretend for the tourists. Granddad said his granddad told him stories of the Green Man, a spirit of winter who sought sacrifice and punished those who would not give him his due." Through it all, Jeffry said nothing. "That's why we light the jack-o'-lanterns. That's why the tradition is still here today. We light them so we might forget that demon who once haunted us. We light them because they keep him away. You've left us naked in the breeze, boy. You've burned our greenhouses, smashed our talismans, and now there'll be nothing to stop him from coming back tonight." The sheriff stared at him, but Jeffry said nothing. "Did you see him, boy? Did you see that devil?" He wrung his hands over the bars like a drowning man treading water, but Jeffry refused to answer him. After he'd wrung those bars for a few minutes, the sheriff finally left. Jeffry never saw him again. Jeffry never saw much of anyone ever again. When he heard the creak and groan of pavement and metal being separated, Jeffry smiled. He knew they had come for him, and when the bars on the street parted from the cement, he looked up to see Kevin and Chris had returned for him. They were still wearing their masks, but Jeffry had an idea that those masks weren't rubber anymore. Jeffry had an idea that those masks were permanent now, and his would be too, once he slipped it on. Jeffry crawled onto street level, falling to his knees when he saw that he was with them. The voice in his head told him that he needed one more. Those 2 imps needed a leader. The rider tossed something rubber to the pavement at Jeffrey's feet, and with trembling hands, Jeffrey slid the grotesque pumpkin mask back on. The voice told him he had work to do. The green man called Jeffrey to action, and who was he to deny him? When I moved in with my grandma about 5 years ago, I didn't know what to expect. Grandma had been living alone since Grandpa died earlier that year, and when they diagnosed her with dementia when I was a senior in high school, it seemed like a bad omen. Though they had caught it early, the doctor had suggested that living alone would probably only help her condition deteriorate faster. Dementia patients often see their condition slow when they have company. Your mother has lived alone since your father died, and if someone were able to live with her, I think the ability to have someone to talk to would help her immensely. Mom and Dad had looked at each other, not sure what to do about the situation, but seemed to come to a decision pretty quickly. With me looking at college and them unable to afford housing in the dorm, they offered me a compromise. Live with my grandmother, attend college nearby, or spend some time trying to get a scholarship and a grant to pay for my own housing. Grandma and I had always been close, and she was delighted to let me stay with her a while. There was no worry that I would sneak boys in or throw parties. It wasn't really something that I was into, and they knew that I'd be home most every evening studying or resting for the coming day. I moved in at the beginning of the academic year, and that meant I was there for Halloween. Grandma and I had been living pretty harmoniously, only butting heads a few times when I came home late from class. Grandma liked to be in bed by 9, and she didn't like to be woken up when I came in late. Grandma liked to spend her time in bed, knitting or watching TV, but I still came in and had a chance to talk and visit a little. Some days she knew who I was, some days she thought I was my mom, but she was never hostile or confused with me. If she called me by my mom's name, I was Claire. If she called me by my name, then I was Julia. Either way, we talked about our day and about life in general. I learned a lot of family secrets that way, things that she was surprised I didn't remember, and I was glad for this time with her while she was still lucid. So, when I came in to find her putting candy in a bowl, I was shocked that she was out of bed. She was huffing and puffing, clearly exhausted, and I wondered when she'd had time to buy candy. She didn't drive, didn't even have a car, and I didn't remember buying it. She looked up happily, holding the bowl out to me in greeting. "Claire, there you are! I wanted to hand candy out to the kids, but I feel so weak. I must be coming down with something, but I can't disappoint the kiddos." Grandma seemed to forget that she was pushing 65 and not in what anyone would call the best of shape. When she did too much and ran out of energy, she always said that she must be coming down with something and took herself off to bed to rest. It seemed to be her mind's way of explaining it. Somehow it seemed I had forgotten it was Halloween, but Grandma hadn't. It wasn't that surprising. If there was one thing you could count on Grandma to remember, it was Halloween. Grandma had always been in love with Halloween, at least according to Mom. She'd insisted that I decorate earlier in the month, had made us go get pumpkins from the store, which I then carved and set on the stoop, and if she had been in better health, she would have likely been in a costume handing out candy. As it stood, she was lucky to have made it from her room to the table, and I knew it. I took the bowl and told her not to worry, and that I would make sure the kids got their candy. She thanked me and went to lie down, her energy spent. I went to the porch and put out the bowl of candy. I put a note on the stool so the kids knew it was a 2-piece limit, and came back in to study. Tonight might be sugar palooza for the little goblins out in the street, but for me, tomorrow was Chem midterm, and I needed to study. I was doing well, but this was only freshman year. I had big dreams, and they would be harder to fulfill with poor marks in chemistry. I heard the kids shrieking and giggling as they came up the road, heard their footsteps on the porch, heard the steps pause in speculation as they read the sign, and then heard them retreat after they took their candy. Grandma lived in a fairly nice area, and the kiddos seemed to be used to the two-piece rule. I'm sure some of them took a handful and ran, but they seemed to be in the minority, if they did. It was dark out, probably pushing 9, when I heard a knock on the door. I looked up from my book, peering at the door as I saw the outline of a little kid in a ghost costume. He was standing there patiently, bag in hand, and I wondered how he had missed the bowl in the sign. Maybe he was looking for an authentic experience, or maybe he was special needs. Either way, I got up and walked to the door to see what he wanted. I opened the door to find the kid in an honest-to-God bedsheet ghost costume. He looked right out of a Charlie Brown special, and the shoes poking out from the bottom looked like loafers. He held a grubby pillowcase in one hand and a candy apple in the other, and when he looked up at me through the holes in the sheet, I almost laughed. He looked like a caricature, like a memory of a Halloween long ago, and I wasn't sure he could speak for a moment. When he did, I wished he hadn't. His voice was raspy, unused, and it sucked all the joy out of me. "Is Mady here?" he asked, and I shook my head as I tried to get my own voice to work. "Nah, sorry, kiddo, there's no Mady here." He nodded and then turned and left with slow, somber steps. I thought it was odd. He hadn't even taken any candy, and when I closed the door and went back to my work, I was filled with a strange and unexplainable sense of dread. I had forgotten about it by the time Halloween rolled around again, but the little ghost hadn't forgotten about us. October 31st found me once again sitting at the table and studying for a midterm. I was still working on my prerequisites for biochem, and if everything went as planned, I'd be starting the course next year. Grandma was much the same, maybe a little more tired and a little more forgetful, but we still spent a lot of our evenings chatting and watching TV. Sometimes she braided my hair, sometimes she showed me how to knit, but we always spent at least an hour together every evening. Tonight, she had turned in early, saying she was really tired and wanted to get some rest before this cold caught up to her. I'd set the candy bowl on the front porch, careful to add the usual note, and when someone knocked on the door at about 8:30, I looked up to see the same little silhouette I had seen the year before. I got up, telling myself it couldn't be the same kid, but when I opened the door, there he was. Same bedsheet ghost costume, same faux leather loafers, same bulge around the eyes to indicate glasses, same slightly dirty pillowcase. It was him, just as he had been the year before, and I almost prayed that he would remember before speaking. "Is Mady here?" he said, in the same croaking voice, and I tried not to shudder as I smiled down at him. "Sorry, kiddo, wrong house." He nodded solemnly, turning around and slowly walking back up the front walk as he made his way back to the street. I watched him go, not quite sure what to make of this strange little ghost boy, or his apparent lack of growth. The kid looked like he might be 5 or 6, though his voice sounded like he might be 5 or 6 years in his grave. I briefly considered that he might be a real ghost, but I put that out of my mind. It was the time of year, nothing more. I went back to studying, finishing out the evening by visiting with Grandma when she got up from her nap. We drank cocoa and watched a scary movie, and I fell asleep beside her in the bed that she had once shared with Grandpa. The next year saw the return of the little ghost boy, and he was unchanged. I tried to ask him why he kept coming back after being told that she wasn't here for 2 years running. I wanted to ask him why he thought she was here, but I couldn't bring myself to ask him anything. There was a barrier between us that went deeper than a misunderstanding, and it was like we were standing on opposite sides of a gulf and shouting at each other over the tide. He left when I didn't say anything, nodding and turning like he always did, before disappearing into the crowd. I didn't see him the year after that, but to be fair, I was a little preoccupied. That was my 4th year in college, and I was only a year from graduating and moving on to work in the field of biochemistry. I'd been heading home when a colleague of mine invited me to a little department party. I was helping my teacher as a TA, and the other TAs were having a little get-together in honor of the season. I started to decline, but I thought it might be fun. I'd never really allowed myself to get into the college scene, never really partied or hung out with friends, and all that focus takes a toll sometimes. I hadn't really been to a social gathering since high school, and I was curious to see what it was like. I'll admit I indulged a little more than I should have, but when I came home and found my grandmother lying by the front door, it sobered me up pretty quickly. Her doctor said that she had fallen when she tried to get to the door, and I couldn't help but wonder if she had been going to answer the knock of a certain little ghost boy. They kept her in the hospital for nearly 3 months, monitoring her and making sure that she hadn't given herself brain damage or something. Her condition progressed while she was in the hospital, and after a time, she either only recognized me as my mother or didn't recognize me at all. She began asking for Albie, always looking for Albie, but I didn't know who that was. Mom was puzzled too, wondering if she were talking about her dad, whose name was Albert. I've never heard her call him Albie, but I suppose it could be a nickname. They knew each other as kids, so it's entirely possible. After a while, they sent her home, but the prognosis was not good. They gave her less than a year to live, saying she would probably need round-the-clock care from now on. I didn't need to be asked this time. I felt guilty for not being there, and I knew that I had to be there for her now. I took a leave of absence from school, putting my plans on hold so I could take care of my grandma. I continued to take some courses online, hoping not to get too far behind, but I devoted most of my time to her. She was mostly unresponsive, whispering sometimes as she called out for Albie or her mother and father, great-grandparents I'd never met. She talked to Albie about secret places and hidden treasures, and her voice was that of a little girl now. She had regressed even more, and every day that I woke up to find her breathing was a blessing. Grandma proved them wrong, and when Halloween came around again, I was in for a surprise. I had taken to sleeping on a cot at the foot of her bed, keeping an ear out for the sound of trouble, but a loud clatter from the kitchen had me rolling to my feet and looking around in confusion. I looked at the bed and saw that she was still in it, so the sound couldn't have been her. As another loud bang sounded in that direction, I was off and moving before I could think better of it. I was afraid that an animal had gotten in the house. Not a burglar. No burglar would have made so much noise. And when I came into the kitchen, I saw, just for a second, a furry black backside of some cat or dog, or maybe a small bear. As it climbed out of the cabinet that it had been rooting through, I saw it was a person, though it was certainly a grubby one. It was a little girl, maybe 6 or 7. She looked filthy. She was wearing a threadbare black dress and curly-toed shoes and a pointed hat that she scooped off the floor. The longer I looked at her, the more I came to understand that she wasn't really dirty. She was just covered in what had to be stove ash. She didn't seem to notice me. She was digging through cupboards and drawers as she searched for whatever it was that she was after, leaving destruction in her wake. "Hey," I called out after some of my surprise had faded. "What are you doing?" The girl turned and looked confused at me. "What are you doing here? This is my house. You better leave before my mama sees you and gets mad." She continued to look through things, working her way into the living room, and I followed behind her, not sure what to say. Was this a dream? If it was a pretty weird one. I could feel the carpet beneath my feet, hear the leaky faucet in the kitchen, smell the lunch I had cooked a few hours ago. The little girl had wrecked half the living room, before I shook off my discomfort and asked her what she was looking for. If this was a dream, then I suppose I had to play along. I need my pillowcase, the one with the pumpkin on it. It's my special Halloween bag, and I can't go trick-or-treating without it. I opened my mouth to ask where she'd left it, but I stopped suddenly as something occurred to me. I had seen that pillowcase before. It had been in Grandma's closet for ages, and when I'd offered to wash it for her, she had shaken her head and said it had too many memories. There was a pumpkin drawn on it, in charcoal, a black cat on the other side, and a witch hat between them. Someone had sewn things around the top so that it could be pulled shut, and it looked like a grubby peddler's sack. Surely, if this was a dream, then Grandma wouldn't mind if I gave this child the bag. Maybe that's why she'd been keeping it, just in case this kid came looking for it. I told the girl to wait a minute and that I'd get it for her. Okay, but hurry. Halloween won't last all night. Took me a little looking, but I finally found it under some old quilts at the top of the closet. At some point, Grandma had recolored the cat and the hat, and I wondered when she'd had the time or the energy. She hadn't even been out of bed without me by her side for over a year, so this must have been before her fall. I took the bag out to the living room and held it out to the little girl, her eyes lit up, and she snatched it happily as she danced around and thanked me. Thank you, thank you, thank you, she trumpeted. Now I can go trick-or-treating. As soon as if on cue, a knock came from the door. The little witch ran to answer it, and I was unsurprised to see the little ghost boy waiting for her. Mady, he said happily, and she wrapped him in a hug like she hadn't seen him in years. Albie, are you ready to go? She trumpeted in return. For ages, slowpoke, he said, the smile beneath the sheet coming out in his words. The two left the porch hand in hand, disappearing into the crowd as they went to go trick-or-treating. I watched them go, feeling a mixture of warmth and completion, and that was when I remembered my grandma. I'd left her alone for a long while, and when I went to check on her, I found her too still in her bed. I started to begin CPR, but after putting a couple of fingers on her throat, I knew it was too late. She was cold. She'd likely been dead before I was awoken by the clatter in the kitchen, and I held back tears as I called the ambulance and let my parents know that she had passed. The funeral was quick. Grandma was laid to rest next to Grandpa, and a week later, I was helping Mom clean out Grandma's house. It was my house now. Grandma had left it to me in her will, and Mom was packing up some mementos and deciding what to donate. We were going through her closet when I found a box with keepsakes in it. There was a picture of Mom when she was little, wedding photos of Grandma and Grandpa, and some letters that Grandpa had written her during Vietnam. Mom came over as I was going through them, smiling at the pictures and crying a little over the letters, but I felt my breath stick in my throat as I came to a very old photo at the bottom of the box. It was a small photo of two kids in costumes on the front porch of a much different house. One was a ghost, his eye holes bulging with glasses. The other was a witch who had clearly rubbed wood ash on her face. Julia? Mom asked, the picture shaking in my hand. Honey, are you okay? The picture fell back into the box, and there on the back was the last piece of the puzzle. Madeline and Albert. Halloween, 1960. That was the last I saw of the little witch or the ghost. But when Halloween comes to call, the two are never far from my mind. I always hand out candy and decorate the house, just as Grandma would have wanted. You never quite know what sort of ghosts and goblins might come to visit. Come on, Dad, let's go! Lily stomped a slipper-clad foot on the sidewalk as she looked back at her father. She was ready to go trick-or-treating, and it seemed like nothing but Josh was standing in the way of her sweet treats. He was sitting on the front step of his childhood home, a well-loved cul-de-sac teeming with costumed children. The moon hung overhead, a ghostly sickle that presided over this Halloween night, and her dad was sitting with his back against the smooth stairs as he found his eyes tracking the multitudes as they passed. The children laughed and screamed as they stalked by, the street a sea of superheroes, video game characters, colorful animals, and everything in between. He let his eyes drift past the excited pageantry, though. He was looking for one shape in particular. Josh's mom smiled at him, slipping her hand into Lily's and giving her a little tug. "Come on, hun. Your dad's waiting for someone. We'll go trick-or-treating while he waits." Lily looked interested. "Who are you waiting for, Daddy?" Of course, she wouldn't have remembered from last year. She'd been excited about trick-or-treating, showing off her Wonder Woman costume, and swinging between her father and her mother's hands as they walked. However, Laura was 6 months pregnant this year, and had opted out of the hour drive to get to his mother's house. She had smiled at Josh knowingly as he left, and told him to tell her hi for her. Lily's grandmother smoothed her hair as it sat under the tall princess hat. "It's just an old friend, dear. Your father meets him here every year." "Well, you're gonna miss out on the candy," Lily said, her tone stating firmly that she wouldn't be sharing if he didn't come. Josh smiled. "That's okay, Lily. You go and have fun with Grandma, okay?" Lily just shrugged, her grandmother's tugging hand finally leading her towards the waiting cacophony of spooky delights. She glanced back as they walked onto the street, but was soon lost in the crowd and probably wouldn't remember anything about this conversation until next year. Josh leaned back, getting comfy as he waited for him to arrive. He did this every year, every Halloween after that first so many years ago. In many ways, the visits were what Josh looked forward to the most about Halloween. Sure, the candy was nice, the costumes were great, but seeing his friend was why he always came home for Halloween. No matter where Josh was, no matter what he was doing, he always came home for Halloween. This was the night he got to see him. This was the night that Josh got to see Snarf again. Snarf had been a mutt. He was a bull terrier mixed with a basset hound mixed with God only knew what else. They had grown up together. Snarf was just a puppy when Josh had got him, and he was Josh's best friend for many years. When Josh thought back on that time in his life, he was glad he had gotten Snarf when he did. Kindergarten had been a difficult time for him, and his sheltered upbringing hadn't really prepared him for suddenly being around so many children. He was awkward, and not what you would call popular. He had thick glasses, was overweight, and his isolation had made him painfully shy. The other kids who had gone to daycare and Cub Scouts and T-ball together, took one look at him and dismissed him as a social outcast. It was tough, being unwanted at the age of 5. His mom thought a dog might help Josh's confidence, or at least ease some of the loneliness. In many ways, Josh believed his mother had recognized that the funk he was in was partially her fault, and was trying to make amends. She worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and often Josh was left in the care of his grandmother. She loved him and always doted on him, but she wasn't always up for the games a 5-year-old would be interested in. Thinking about it over the years, Josh often thought that Snarf was a way for her to alleviate some of the guilt about leaving him alone. Whatever the reason, he had loved her for it. His mother found Snarf at the Humane Society. He was a little smiling ball of fluff, and when he put his feet against the glass, she had known that he would be perfect. He had been waiting for Josh when she had come to pick him up that day, and the boy's surprise had turned to joy as the wet puppy tongue slid over his face. They sat in the back seat the whole way home, the dog's head against his stomach, panting happily as Josh scratched him behind the ears. He was that rare animal whose temperament never led him to jump up on people or bark for no reason. His accidents were few and far between, and he was easy to house train. They called him Snarf because he had a deviation in his nose that caused him to make a snarfing sound rather than a proper bark. He was the best dog, the only one Josh had ever owned, and Josh had flourished with the help of his new companion. Snarf had gotten him out of the house, helping him shed some of the baby fat that had made him the subject of so much ridicule. He had also been a great icebreaker to help Josh introduce himself to some of the neighborhood kids. By the time he had entered 1st grade, Josh had a few pals, but none of them could hold a candle to his friendship with that wiggling little mass of fur and ears. He was eternally thankful for the time he'd gotten with Snarf, but it would never have been enough. Josh dumped a fistful of candy into each of their buckets, and the trio of Disney princesses said thank you as they ran to the next house in a flurry of skirts and sneakers. A pirate wandered up and gave him his best "Arg!" Josh rewarded him with a couple of full-size Snicker bars, and he thanked him before wobbling off on his fake peg leg. Josh kept scanning the crowd, unsure what was taking his friend so long this year. He was usually here by now, but he had been late before. He sat up a little as he saw a small ghost, 4 legs poking from below a bedsheet. When it turned and wagged its tail at a larger ghost who was walking behind it, Josh got comfortable again. He sat scanning around, hoping it wouldn't be too much longer. He'd sit here all night if he had to, though. Josh would sit here till midnight if it bought him 5 minutes with his buddy. Josh had Snarf for 5 years, and those 5 years were filled with mostly good times between a boy and his dog. Snarf was never a chewer or prone to digging holes, and Josh couldn't remember ever having to fill in a hole or run after him as he chased a cat. Snarf also knew where the boundaries of his home were, and Josh never saw him run out of the yard or get in the road after a car. He was a good boy, and the neighborhood loved him. He would likely have a long and happy life if it hadn't been for Josh. To this day, he blamed himself for what had happened to Snarf. It had all started when Reggie moved into the neighborhood. Reggie moved in when Josh was 10, and his family took up residence in the Cranston house. Mr. Cranston had died about a month before, and though his family hadn't been neighbors with them, Mr. Cranston was a nice old man who was known to the whole neighborhood. He had always had the best yard displays for Christmas or Halloween, and he had given out the best candy to trick-or-treaters. When the ambulance came to take him away one night, everyone had hoped for the best, but poor Mr. Cranston had died of a heart attack. Luckily, he had been on the phone with his daughter when it had happened, or who knows when they would have found him. So when a moving van came up the street bound for Mr. Cranston's old house, Josh and his friends had hopped on their bikes and went to check it out. Josh had a group of friends that he hung out with then. Terry, Walt, and Patrick lived in the same neighborhood as he did, and they'd been friends for years. When the new boy was seen unpacking boxes from the van, they introduced themselves and welcomed him to the neighborhood. He was a big kid, tall and muscular, and Josh had gotten a weird feeling about him almost at once. "I'm Josh," he said, extending a hand. "We were just about to go play some ball if you're interested." "Reggie," the boy said, squeezing his hand a little too hard, almost like he meant to hurt him. "Yeah, sounds like that might be fun." One short conversation was enough to let the boys know that Reggie's interests were different than theirs. Most of them had agreed later that they felt he probably wasn't going to be a good fit for the group, and not just because of his attitude. He had scoffed at their comic books, asked if they were babies when they talked about action figures, and when he'd said that baseball sounded fun, it made everyone shiver a little. He was large, a sneering boy, and they all decided to keep their distance from him as they said their goodbyes and pedaled away. But of course, Reggie lived on the block, so he inevitably found a place in their games. He was never invited, always just sort of invited himself. He made the teams uneven, and no one seemed to want him to play, but the boys were too polite to tell him to buzz off. That was how it started, but Josh and his friends had regretted giving in so easily almost at once. They'd been correct in their assumptions that he liked to hurt people. He had nearly broken Patrick's wrist when he fouled him during basketball. He had shoved Terry off his bike during a bike race, skinning both his hands and his knees. And every time he threw a football to you, you either caught it or you wound up with a bloody nose. By the end of the summer, their politeness had turned into fear, and they were all too afraid of him to tell him to go away when he came to invite himself to their games. They were playing baseball when it happened. Reggie had seen them setting up and inserted himself into the game, as he usually did. Terry sighed loudly, covering it up with a cough when Reggie got close enough to hear them. Josh and Terry had tried to explain that letting him play would make the teams uneven, but Reggie didn't really care. He made it pretty clear that he was going to play whether they liked it or not, and there wasn't really anything that could be done about it. Snarf had walked up then, snuffling Josh's hand for pats, and Josh had dropped to his knees to give him scratches. The dog accepted the attention, but his eyes never left Reggie, and Josh could see the mistrust in them. Reggie was the only person that Josh had ever seen elicit a growl from the usually good-natured dog. Reggie had quickly learned not to come into Josh's yard, as Snarf would not tolerate him. This was fine with Josh, because unlike the others, whose houses Reggie frequently visited, Snarf had kept him out of his yard and his fingers off of Josh's stuff. Josh was also careful to keep Snarf inside when he wasn't out there to supervise him. He had seen the way Reggie's piggy little eyes narrowed when he looked at the dog, and Josh knew enough to be cautious. He wished he'd just put Snarf inside when he started growling that day, but he had pushed it away and hoped it would help Reggie know that they wouldn't tolerate any funny business. The game had gone about as well as expected until the 5th inning. Reggie and Terry had been team captains, and Reggie had won the coin toss, so he got to pick first. Reggie and Walt had been on a team, and Terry and Josh had been on another, with Patrick acting as an umpire or standing in if someone got tired. Reggie had belted a few down the road, and he and Walt were winning 7-3. The trade-off for Reggie's freakish strength was that he wasn't particularly coordinated. He missed a few fly balls and let a few slide between his legs, so Josh and Terry weren't as far behind as they could have been. There had been some good-natured shoving, as good-natured as it ever got with Reggie, but there was no real violence to speak of. Snarf had gone to lounge on his lawn, and the boys were actually having fun, despite 4 of them having to keep an eye on the 5th. It all went south when Reggie took the plate again. He cracked it a good one, and Josh and Terry prepared to get out of the way as Reggie ran. Reggie did not believe in dropping the bat after hitting the ball, as the bruises on the boy's ankles could attest. The bat made a loud crack as it hit the ball, and as it sailed off down the street, Josh made a dash for it. Reggie came running around first base, Terry hovering between second and third, as Patrick stood on the manhole that was serving as the pitcher's mound. Patrick had quickly figured out that a third might be required when the teams took the field, and had agreed to be the pitcher and the umpire. Walt was whistling as Reggie ran for second, and the ball bounced once before Josh grabbed it. He had turned to throw it when he heard Terry yell out in pain. Terry, Walt would later tell him, had tripped Reggie as he ran past, and the big boy had fallen and skinned his hands and knees. Reggie had come up mad, cracking him in the stomach with the bat, and towering over him as the fallen boy prepared to have his skull caved in. Josh dropped the ball, sprinting towards the pair, as Reggie lifted the bat up to hit Terry again. Walt ran from the sidelines as Patrick came shouting and telling Reggie to knock it off. All 3 of them knew they wouldn't make it before he hit Terry, and they were just hoping to get there before he hit him again. Fast as they were, though, Snarf was faster. Snarf hit Reggie in the back, sending him reeling forward and dropping him into the street a second time. He stood over Terry protectively, snarling and showing his teeth at Reggie's back. Reggie was getting back up, shaking his head, but Snarf didn't seem to want to attack him. He just stood over Terry, the boy still frozen in surprise and fear. Reggie got back on his feet, his knuckles turning white against the bat's handle as he squeezed. Josh saw him turn in slow motion, the boy still running for Terry, but it made no difference. Snarf was staring daggers at Reggie, but when Josh called his name, he looked towards him, tail wagging. The bat crashed down on the dog, and the pitiful noise he made sent a shard of glass through Josh's guts. Walt and Patrick arrived in time to grab Terry under the arms and drag him away from the scene. Josh hit Reggie as hard as he could around the waist, dropping him to the concrete a 3rd time and sending the bat clinking across the asphalt with an angry wooden clitter. Reggie hit his head on the concrete, and as the wind oofed out of him, Josh punched him in the face. He saw Reggie's eyes glaze a little with the impact, his lips quivering in surprise as his head bounced off the pavement again. Josh got off him, picking up the bat as Reggie tried to get his bearings. Josh pointed the bat at Reggie, yelling at him to get out of here. He told him not to come near him, his friends, or his dog again. He said some of the adult words he knew, the cusses sounding high and whispery as he fought back tears. Reggie got up on an elbow, grinning at Josh as he seemed to dare him to do anything. When the other 3 boys came up behind him, though, Reggie realized that he might be in trouble if he decided to act in haste. He could take 1 kid, bat or no bat, but 4 kids would probably beat the tar out of him. So, he backed up on his hands before breaking into a run and fleeing for home. Josh would never feel bad about what he had done to Reggie, but looking back at that moment, he would feel a lot of shame. The shame came from letting his anger blind him to Snarf's pain, from letting his need to dispel Reggie separate him from his dog when he needed him most. It didn't matter, though. None of it really mattered. When Josh turned back around, it was already too late. Josh found himself glaring at Reggie's old house as he watched a pair of Transformers walk off with their chocolate. The house was occupied now, but it had been empty for quite some time after the family had moved away. That had happened later, months after he'd killed Snarf, and those months felt like an eternity at the time. Reggie's parents had refused to believe that their son had killed Snarf, and they seemed angrier that Josh and his friends had beaten up their son. When they threatened to call the police, after Reggie had come home with scrapes and bruises, Josh's mom had just dropped the whole thing. Reggie's parents are threatening to sue us for hospital costs, and I can't afford something like that, sweetie. I'm sorry about Snarf, but if we call the cops, we'll be in trouble as well. She told Josh this, and he had seethed in his 10-year-old heart. He saw a big blonde kid with a crew cut, dressed in a karate gi, and he almost didn't hand him anything. Reggie was still on his mind, and this kid could have passed for him once upon a time. His eyes, they didn't really have that evil gleam in them, though, and Josh smiled at him as he handed him some candy. The kid threw him a mock salute and rejoined the throng still parading up the street. Reggie had been bigger, meaner, but in the end, Reggie had not been braver. Josh had been inconsolable after the death of Snarf. He had pretended to be sick for a week, and his mother had just let him pretend in the wake of his sorrow. His grandma stayed with him, often just sitting with Josh while he wallowed in his misery. She never pushed him as he moped around the house, just letting him feel his hurt as she waited for it to pass. He mostly just lay on the couch and watched TV, not really paying attention, just liking the noise. As they sat there one afternoon, her arm draped around him, she told Josh something he would never forget. "I know you miss your friend, but you can't let his death be the end of your life. You have to live it for both of you now. It's what he would have wanted." Josh looked up at her with big swimmy eyes. But I miss him." She smiled. "I know you do, but it's almost Halloween, a time when they say the ghosts of our loved ones can walk the earth again. Maybe, just maybe, his love will be great enough to bring him back to you." That made him think. If ghosts and spirits could walk the earth on Halloween, then maybe Snarf could too. Josh spent the rest of the month in a little better mood, waiting for Halloween night so he could see if Snarf would come and visit. His mom had to work on Halloween, but Grandma was home with him and said that she could take him out trick-or-treating if he wanted. Josh didn't want to go out, though. He sat in his room and watched out the window, hoping to see Snarf as he ran up the front walk. When his friends came to see him, they were all costumed and looking for him to join their group. They begged him to trick-or-treat with them. They hadn't seen him in months. He hadn't come out to play since the baseball game, and they missed him. Each of them was dressed as a different Power Ranger, and Terry said his grandma had sent him a second costume if Josh wanted to use it. Josh had a feeling that Terry had bought it in case he decided to come out with them, and though touched, Josh still didn't want to go. He might miss Snarf, and he wanted to see him if he came back. Once again, Grandma had the answer. "I'll keep an eye out for him, and I'll tell him to stay if he comes to see you while you're gone." Josh was hesitant, but after some coaxing, he put on the costume and left with his group of friends. They had made him the Blue Ranger, his favorite Power Ranger, and as they set out into the night, he felt a little better. Josh had missed his friends over the past few weeks, but after what had happened, he just couldn't bring himself to see them. Going out with him now made him feel a lot better, and they spent a few blissful hours filling their sacks with candy. It would have been a perfect Halloween if Reggie hadn't come. Josh started noticing lights going out in the cul-de-sac as it ticked closer to 10. The kids who were present were becoming older, the little kids already turning in, and he furrowed his brow as Snarf still hadn't appeared. He felt like he had on that first Halloween after Snarf's death, looking for him as he'd walked the streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. Josh heard a bark and snapped his head to the side expectantly. He frowned, though, when he saw it was just a lab in a bee costume. Its owner came hurrying after him, followed by a football player heading for the next house. A pair of ninjas wandered up next, and Josh sighed as he dug them out some candy. Surely he wouldn't stand him up. He hadn't stood him up that night, so why start now? It was almost 10 by the time the lights started going out on that long-ago Halloween. The street began to empty, and Josh's bag was beginning to get heavy. He and his friends had bulging sacks of candy, and they were sitting on the sidewalk and trading. Josh had started out looking for Snarf, glancing around as they walked against the tide of excited children. In those 2 hours, he had gotten a reprieve from his sadness, but as the night wound down, the old feelings were starting to fester again. He told his friends that he had to get home, and Josh started looking for him again as he moved through the thinning group of trick-or-treaters. He wanted to get home so he could see if Snarf had come back, which was probably why he missed Reggie. When the egg hit him in the side of the head, Josh staggered under the impact. His ear rang, and he thought he was bleeding when his gloved hand came away wet. One look told him it was just egg yolk, though. He looked across the street and saw Reggie grinning at him from under a lamppost. He wasn't in costume, dressed in his baseball shorts and a tank top, but he did have a silver bat in his hand, tossing an egg up and catching it in his other as he smiled. Josh froze when he saw that he was staring at him, realizing how vulnerable he was out here alone with his house 3 street lights away. Been waiting for you to come out. We got unfinished business, Four Eyes. I think I owe you the same sort of beating I gave your stupid dog, he chuckled, swinging the bat experimentally. Josh stepped off the curve towards him, angry at what he had said, but thought better of it immediately. That metal bat could cave his skull in, and Reggie was pretty good at swinging bats. He glanced towards his house instead. 3 streetlights didn't seem so far, and Josh thought he could probably run faster than Reggie if it came to it. It seemed it was either run or sit here and get killed by this psycho. The choice seemed pretty obvious. He made the first light, easily outstriping Reggie, but Josh heard him getting closer as he moved under the second light. Reggie slapped the light pole with the bat as he went by, and it made a hollow thunk sound as it connected. Josh started to panic when he heard it. What if he caught him? What if he killed him? Would he die in the street like Snarf had? Josh wished that Snarf was here as his tears streamed down his face. He would have protected him. Snarf would have stopped Reggie from hurting him. If Josh hadn't distracted him that day, maybe Snarf would be here to help him. His house was in sight when the second egg cracked him in the back of the head. He stumbled as the egg connected. Josh had forgotten about the eggs. Though it hadn't been thrown very hard, it surprised him. Josh staggered into the fence that separated his yard from the neighbor's and crashed against it with a loud thunk. His head connected with the boards as he fell, and his head swam a little as the cheap plastic mask broke into pieces. Josh was reaching out in slow motion, moving his hands and legs like someone wading through mud. He rolled onto his butt as he prepared to take off again, but it was too late. Reggie loomed over him, the streetlight gleaming off his bat. "Looks like I caught you, Four Eyes," Reggie said, raising the bat. "Say hi to your dog for me when you see him." Josh pushed up against the fence, hoping it would fall backwards, knowing it wasn't going anywhere. Reggie raised the bat high, the metal twinkling as the light made galaxies of starbursts. Josh closed his eyes, preparing for the blow that would end his life prematurely. When the growl split the night, though, he opened his eyes and looked between Reggie's splayed legs. Reggie had turned his head to look at the shadowy crevice between the house and the fence that now stopped Josh from escaping. Between the structures stood a snarling, red-eyed creature that seemed to fill the space with its shadowy mass. Reggie took a sidelong step away from Josh, the beast snarling hugely as it took a single thunderous step towards him. Josh felt his breath hitch as Reggie stepped into the street, and the looming thing lowered its head and rumbled. Josh's brain couldn't fathom it. This nightmare creature had appeared in his neighborhood out of nowhere, and was now seconds away from ending both him and his bully. When it loosed that single ear-splitting snarl, Josh put his head between his knees and pushed his palms against his ears. He sat in the darkness, screaming against his legs as he prepared to be devoured. Josh had assumed that he would die that night after running from the hulking brute, but never like this. When the warm tongue slid over his hair, he cracked the back of his head against the fence, trying to escape again. Then he opened his eyes, gasping like a trapped animal, to find Snarf's panting, grinning face. Reggie was gone, bat lying in the street, and Josh wrapped his arms around his lost friend. He laughed as Snarf licked his cheek. He pressed his face against the dog's familiar short fur, and Josh's sadness melted away as Snarf's doggy tongue bombarded him. That was how his mom had found him, laughing with his back against the fence as her headlights dissipated the ghostly dog licking him as he'd done so many times before. Snarf had come back and visited him on Halloween night every year since. His mother didn't come right out and say it at first. She was upset about his injuries, but she told Josh later that she had seen Snarf for a few seconds before her headlights hit him. After he told her what had happened with Reggie, she called the police. She gave them the bat, told them how Reggie had been a problem this summer, and started a process of having a restraining order placed against him. She was tired of being bullied by Reggie's parents, as tired as Josh was of being bullied by Reggie. Reggie's family moved shortly before the order was finalized. Josh never saw him again, and was happier for it. Josh watched his mother walk up the front lawn now, Lily in her arms as she sleepily held onto her sack of candy. She was stumbling on the way back. "I think we're going to have some cocoa if you'd like to join us." "Give me a few more minutes, Mom. I think he's just running late this year." Mom smiled. "Take all the time you need, dear." She walked inside, leaving him on the stoop. The street was emptying, only a few stragglers heading for home. and Josh glanced around furtively. Where was Snarf? Had he forgotten about his old friend? 20 years was a long time to visit someone who wasn't a little boy anymore. Maybe he had... Josh dropped the bowl of candy when that ghostly cold nose prodded his hand. He looked down to find Snarf, tail wagging, as he smiled up at him from the front lawn of the house he had loved so much. Josh wrapped his arms around him, and it felt like coming home again. There's a haunted house on Sherman. No, that's usually where they put a Hallelujah house disguised as a haunted house. Yeah, that's true. There's a pumpkin patch on 8th. What are we, 5? Well, let's see. Oh, there's a corn maze. It's supposed to be pretty good, too. Really good reviews. I sat behind the wheel of my Explorer, finally shrugging. It's better than nothing, I guess. Mark and John pulled out their phones and started looking up reviews. Peter put the address into my phone, pointing off towards the farmland and saying, "Onward to the corn maze." I pulled out of the parking lot and headed out, the sun sinking on the horizon already. Moran wasn't what you would call a cultural mecca. It was a rural farming community with a lot of dairy and poultry farms, as well as the usual acres and acres of produce. For a place with only one Walmart and 3 stoplights, there sure seemed to be a lot of churches with a staggering amount of influence. The town had a lot of kiddie carnivals, fall fairs, and church socials, but there weren't any of the usual things around Halloween, like haunted houses or spooky attractions. You had to be very critical of the ones you did get, because most of them turned out to be Hallelujah houses, and you were more likely to get a sermon than a scare. This corn maze, however, sounded like just what we were after. All the reviews I've found say it's a spooky good time, Peter said. John made a whistling sound. And the cost is pretty reasonable, too. $5 a head, and the money goes to farmland preservation, whatever that is. Preserving farmland, clearly, Peter said, rolling his eyes. Says it's been operating for a while. Wonder why we've never heard of it. Maybe we just weren't looking for it, I said, driving past the city limits as we entered the farmland. The farmland lives up to its name in almost any season. There's always a riot of growing things, fields of produce or orchards of apples and pears. There were pecans as well, grape vineyards, a lot of barns and grazing land for cows, sheep, horses, and any number of other livestock. The fields today were mostly full of pumpkins and corn, typical crop for the season, and we passed more than one pumpkin patch in full swing. The setting sun would send many of them home with their prizes, but for us, the night would hopefully bring plenty of thrills and chills. The farm in question, the Lazy Stalk, was not one I was familiar with, but there were so many farms out here that it wasn't out of the question that I'd missed one. My brothers and I often spent our summers working at the Flying J or the Quarter Moon, but there were more farms than farmers out here these days. The idea of starting fresh with about 50 acres and some seeds was appealing as the world slowly went to hell around us. But most of the new farms closed up shop when they realized that there was more to it than plowing and growing and selling. The Lazy Stalk, the sign bearing a grinning pumpkin and a leaning cornstalk, didn't seem new, but that didn't mean anything. New or old, the corn maze they boasted was absolutely massive. We pulled into the little dooryard, a dirt track with several cars already parked in it, and I could see a fellow in overalls who looked like a caricature of some Midwestern farmer. His overalls were denim, the pant legs rolled up to the ankles, and his bare feet seemed to be part of the muddy ground at the edge of the field. Behind him rose the corn, tamed through some dark magic into a maze, and as we approached the man, I heard him whistling something around a bit of straw perched in his mouth, the knife he was using to carve the wood in his hand sliding against the shape with delicious repetition. "Really leaning into that Cornhusker vibe, ain't he?" Mark asked side-mouth, and John elbowed him as if to say, "Be polite." "Hey there," I said as we approached. "We're here for the corn maze," he asked, around the slip of straw. The wood shavings fell from the piece he was carving, and I became quite certain it was a pumpkin. The stem was beginning to form from the top, and he had already made the face. The grinning mouth seemed to think about biting, and the eyes were full of malicious glee as they looked out at us. "Nope, we're here for the ambience," Mike said in his best northwestern accent, and John elbowed him again. "Yes, sir," I said, pulling out my wallet as he put the finishing touches on the pumpkin and set it aside. "Hey, could I buy that?" I asked, suddenly moved to own it. Couldn't tell you why. It wasn't a particularly amazing carving, but I found myself wanting it, and my question elicited a smile from the old codger. "20 for the group," he said, his veined hands reaching up towards the pumpkin before holding it out shakily. "But the pumpkin is free. Take it with my thanks. It's been a while since anyone admired my carving." "And likely to be," Mark began, but John shot him another preemptive elbow. We paid our money, and when the man handed me the pumpkin, I saw he had threaded a leather piece through it. It was a necklace now, it seemed, and I slipped it on without too much thought. I thought it was kind of cool, and we went inside, the old man wishing us luck, as we came into an immediate crossroads. "Right or left, boys?" I asked, and after some speculation, it was decided that left was our destination. We headed deeper into the maze, expecting to find some spooky decor or even someone in a costume, but it was just corn as far as the eye could see. We took turns at random, alternating between right and left, and the deeper we went, the more sure we were that this would be the turn where we found something. A guy in a costume with a chainsaw, a bunch of body parts or gravestones, an animatronic thing that would flash and scare us all half to death, but nothing came. We went from excitedly chattering to quietly walking, the sound of our feet against the dry corn stalks the only sound. Would that it had stayed that way. We had taken our 10th turn, the sun setting behind the wall of corn and making a shadowy corridor for us to tromp through, when we heard the whistling. It sounded like it was coming from the path ahead of us at first, but pretty soon I saw Peter turn his head so he could look behind us. Other times it seemed to come from the row beside us or from further in the maze, only to circle us like a vulture, before fading to something nearly inaudible again. "Okay, you guys hear that, right?" John asked, wincing as his foot came down on a particularly loud bit of corn husk. "Hear it? It's kind of impossible to miss," Mark said. "You think this is the big scary thing?" Peter asked, squinting up at the setting sun. "If this is what has so many people freaked out, then I'm not impressed." He said it offhandedly, but I didn't believe him. I knew I was a little freaked out by the whistling, but I couldn't really explain why. It felt the way I imagined a bug would feel in your ear, the legs of the whistler scuttling around, trying to find purchase as they raked across my mind. It made me anxious in a way that nothing else ever had, and the deeper into the maze we went, the more I wondered how much deeper we would have to go. How long had we even been walking? Felt like it could have been hours, but it also felt like it could have been mere moments. We kept going. What choice did we have? And the further we went, the more the whistling chased us. It wasn't even whistling any particular tune. It was disconcerting, from one note to the next, and it seemed as if several songs were going on simultaneously. I felt the whistling in my eardrums, in my bones, in my soul. It made me feel like I might be going insane. I didn't know who was whistling or how they made it sound like that, but I certainly didn't want to meet them. The sun was riding low when I caught my first sight of the whistling man, and it was something I could have done without. We came to what had to be the center of the maze, a huge four-way intersection that had been cut like a compass. If we were standing at the southern point, then he was at the northern point, directly across from us. The sun cut a shadow across him as it set lower and lower, but I could still see his long coat, his tall, wide-brimmed hat, and the rags that hung about him, and the darkness that existed within the space between. From beneath the brim of that hat was a single red eye, its reflection seeming to glow as the light of the sun waned, and when he moved off down the long corn corridor, I felt like I could breathe again. "Did you guys see that?" I whispered, but apparently no one else had seen anything. "What?" Peter asked, glancing around, Mark and John following his lead. There was a guy at the end of the road in a big coat." "I didn't see anything," John said. "You sure you aren't—" But he winced when the whistling picked back up again. "Damn it! If this whistling is all there is to it, then I wish they would just get on with it already. It isn't scary," he yelled, clearly trying to get the whistler's attention. "It's just annoying." If the whistler cared or heard, it never let on. It just kept right on whistling as we made our way through the corn, trying to find a way out. We had yet to find a dead end, so we assumed that we must be going the right way, but the corn seemed to go on forever. It couldn't be this large. We had traveled miles, but every turn led to more and more tightly packed stalks, and every mile led to more whistling. The sun got lower and lower, and when it finally set, the maze was plunged into near darkness. I don't think we had realized just how dark it could get out here. Most people used to living with streetlights don't, but with only the sickle moon to light our path, we were plunged into a nearly supernatural darkness, and it seemed to hang around us as much as the whistling. The darkness had done nothing to quell the terrible whistling in the maze, and as we moved slowly through the rows, it circled us like a pack of hungry dogs. "Shouldn't he have come out to get us?" Pete said, his voice pitched low as if afraid something would hear him. I don't know," John said, his teeth chattering as we moved in a clump. The whistling swirled around, rising and falling as it moved ahead, behind, and around us. "If he's doing that, then I wish he'd fucking stop," Mark yelled, his good humor lost. "It's just whistling," I whispered, not sure I wanted to raise my voice either. "It can't hurt us." I said it, but I didn't believe it. "You're wrong," someone said, and I was surprised to see it was John, not Mark. "And if we aren't very lucky, you'll be dead wrong." The whistling was eroding them, making their terror seem like more than it should be, and it didn't take long for us to start breaking. Paul swung his head around, John began to shake, his teeth chattering, and Mark balled his hands up beside him, shaking with rage the further he went. As for me, I felt my terror settling over me like a warm blanket, shuddering in my bones as that whistling clattered around me like jangling bells. Mark was, unfortunately, the first one to break. "Stop it!" he shouted, looking around as if someone might come out to challenge him. "I can't take it anymore! Show yourself!" he demanded. And when something snapped ahead of us, he charged away from the group towards the sound. "Mark, don't!" I screamed, but he was already charging away and heading into the unknown. I grabbed John as he ran after him, begging him to stay with us, and the screams that came from farther up froze all of us in our tracks. Whatever was making that maddening whistling had gotten Mark, and it didn't sound like it was doing anything good to him. His screams arced up and over the corn, sending birds into flight from the stalks before petering off to silence. The whistling started just as the crickets began to tune up again. To hell with this," John stammered, running off the way we'd come. Peter ran in the other direction, the way that Mark had, and I was forced to make a choice. Peter and I had been friends since kindergarten, meeting on our very first day, and if I had to go with one of them, I decided it would be him. We were both running then, neck and neck, and As we sprinted through the maze, the whistling filled our ears like wasps. If John met the same fate as Mark had, I didn't hear him scream. We ran until we were both out of breath. We kept running till the stitch in our sides burned, and as we toppled over in the field of green, I heard the whistling getting closer and closer. We were both sitting with our backs against the corn wall as the man I had seen before came shuffling around the corner, his head almost taller than the maze itself. He whistled as he walked, stalking forward as he came towards us. His hands were living shadows, his one red eye glaring evilly, and as he latched one of those hands around Peter's ankle, I saw the other coming for me. Peter screamed as he yanked him back, dragging him into the field, but that hand seemed to falter when it came to me. He cocked his head, leaning in bonelessly as he looked at the pumpkin on my chest. I'd forgotten I was wearing it, the little wooden trinket picked up at the start of this nightmare. And he shook his head and grunted before speaking in a harsh, raspy voice. "Shame. I was hoping for a bigger meal today." Then he dragged Peter off as I lay there, shivering and weeping as that whistling came to me from the inhuman creature that had taken my friends. That's where they found me, half out of my mind and crying in a fetal ball. I'd been missing for 2 days, and when the cops spotted my SUV in the dooryard of the old farmhouse, they had come out with dogs and found me curled up in the old field behind the farmhouse, laying amongst the few skeletal corn husks. I told them my friends and I had come out to the corn maze, the lazy stalk, and how the old farmer had taken our money and wished us good luck. The cop I was talking to said that particular farm had been abandoned for years, but I wasn't the first kid to come spouting stories about a weird corn maze, an old whittling farmer, and a whistling creature. You'd be about the fourth in as many years, actually. Can't speak for the other two, but the last one was wearing one of those little pumpkins, too," he said, indicating my necklace. "The hunt continues for my friends, but I bear a strange sort of survivor's guilt. I watched Peter get snatched. I did nothing while John and Mark ran off, and somehow this carving saved me. Whatever happened, I fear I may never understand it. But one thing keeps me teetering on the edge of sanity. When I walk the streets, when I lay in bed at night, when I drive to the store, or when I sit alone with my thoughts, I hear the whistling. It's low, thoughtful, utterly discordant. I'm afraid of what'll happen when it gets louder. Afraid of the whistler who makes that sound. And I haven't been without my pumpkin charm since the incident. Whatever charm it holds may be the only thing keeping me from joining my friends."
"Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" Matthew was standing on the front porch, looking up at his mother through the eye holes of his homemade ghost costume. "Mom, I don't feel good. Maybe I won't go out tonight." His mom looked down at him, smiling in that strange way he had become so accustomed to. It was definitely supposed to be his mom, her red hair falling softly around her shoulders as she wore the thrift store bridal gown that she had ripped up for her zombie bride costume. But Matthew knew that it wasn't her. When she turned her head, he could hear the tendons creaking in her neck, and her rictus of a smile made the corners of her mouth turn up painfully. "Come on, honey. Halloween comes but once a year." Matthew sighed, if only that were the case. They stepped off the front porch, making their way into the throng of children that happily capered about the cul-de-sac. His ghost costume looked a little plain when compared to the others, but Matthew couldn't find it in himself to be self-conscious anymore. They weren't kids, at any rate. Not the kids he'd grown up with. Behind their colorful masks or painted faces, their oddly yellow eyelids were black, with soulless eyes. "I can't," Matthew said, letting his hand slip from his mother's. "Can't what, sweetie?" she asked, turning her painful smile on him. "I can't do this anymore," he yelled, throwing his bucket down and rounding on her. The throng of trick-or-treaters turned to stare at him, and Matthew suddenly realized his mistake. Not for the first time, and not for the last. "Sweetie," his mother said, turning slowly, her arms and legs like something full of coat hangers and newspaper. "It's Halloween. You either treat, or you get tricked." The kids began to circle around him, their voices low, their eyes shining like pools of tar. "Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat." Matthew could hear his heart beating in his ears. He could almost hear it as he backed away. It was noisy, soupy, and constantly pounding, fundamentally different from a normal heartbeat in every way. He bumped into a teenage Michael Myers, and the big mute pushed him over before he could properly get his bearings. He fell down hard on his chest, and then they were on him. Luckily, as Matt lay face down on the concrete, he didn't have to watch this time. They ripped his back apart, their sharp little teeth digging into his flesh. He felt the warm blood oozing down his back, the asphalt drinking it up as the kids tore him apart. His arms separated with a sickening pop, his sheet tearing as it was ripped, and Matthew lost consciousness. He hoped that maybe this would be the last time, and that it all would end. He was so tired of being a ghost, tired of Halloween, and as the bright lights made him squint, he felt hot tears joining his blood on the pavement. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" Matthew looked up at his mother, nodding as he reached up and took her hand for the 1,000th time. It didn't feel like a real hand, not anymore. It felt mushy in the wrong places, hard and unmoving in others, like a palsied claw after a loved one's had a stroke. She looked down at him, smiling like a corpse, and Matthew tried to ignore the fact that the skin around her ears was darker than it had been the last time. His mother appeared to be rotting before his eyes, but to make note of it would bring on something worse. He walked once more into the sea of children, watching them run and cheer, but feeling their eyes as they tracked him. The whole street was like living in a forest of lions. Any minute, they might spring from concealment and tear you to pieces. He had been here long enough to know, however, that as long as you played along with this everlasting Halloween, it was content to keep you in its clutches. As they came to the first house, Matthew could see old Mr. Debro as he smiled and stepped through the door. The liver spots on his head were starting to look more like mold, but Matthew tried to ignore it as he shook his bag half-heartedly. The old man would drop 2 small Kit Kats in there and tell him to have a great evening, just like he did every time. And Matthew just wanted to get on with the charade. When the candy didn't fall into the bag like it always did, Matt looked up and saw the grinning face of the old man as it loomed over him. "Forgot your manners, son?" Matthew gasped. He'd become so complacent. He'd been here long enough to know that you didn't get candy unless you said the magic words, but he was so tired. He'd been trick-or-treating for ages, and he was exhausted. Every time he finished, every time he came to the end, good or bad, it would all just begin again. He was starting to feel like, if he looked at his own reflection, he might be the one that was beginning to rot. He tried to stammer out a hurried trick-or-treat, but he could already see the long, sharp legs as they protruded from the corners of the man's mouth. Whatever horrors that lay inside these things, already dragging itself free. The words came from what sounded like a drowned man's throat, or the dying voice of someone who's slowly choking to death. And Matthew heard it just as the pinchers on the horrific whatever it were shot out from between Mr. Debro's stained false teeth and latched onto his head. The teeth clicked together as they hit the ground like a set of sad castanets, but Matthew heard his words as he faded once more into black. "You'll have to remember next time." "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" Matt didn't even look up at her this time. He lifted his hand and grabbed a hold of her withered paw as he let her lead him into the cul-de-sac. He moved on autopilot, remembering only the words that must be said as they came to each house. The candy filled the bag, the grown-ups continuing to smile their hollow grins, and all the while, Matthew trudged onward. He saw the corner coming up, the junction of Marla and Casterly, and Matt saw someone that made him go cold inside. The man was dressed as Indiana Jones, bullwhip hanging jauntily off his waist, and when he turned to wave at someone who had called his name, Matthew steered his mother towards a different house, back the way they had come. "Come on, Mom, we missed the Jafford house. Miss Jafford wants to see your costume, remember?" His mother looked unsure, but she turned away, smiling as she allowed herself to be led. "All right, Mady, don't tug." Matt looked back as he left, seeing the man and knowing that he didn't want his mother to talk to him. She had talked to him once before, hadn't she? She had talked to him, and something bad had happened, but it didn't seem like something that had happened here. He didn't know, he couldn't really say, but when he saw the guy, the ear-shattering heartbeat had come on again, and he suddenly knew that letting her talk to him would be the scariest thing he had ever experienced. As the night went on, Matthew held out hope that the lights might start going off, and that he might be allowed to sleep. The bag was heavy, the pillowcase bulging oddly as it threatened to split, but still, he and his mother walked the streets of the cul-de-sac. How many times had he done this, Matt wondered? 100? 200? 1,000? It felt like an eternity as his sore feet slapped the pavement, and his trainers threatened to fall to pieces. "Do you remember the first time, Mom?" he asked suddenly, his eyes heavy as he repositioned the bag to rub at them. "Your first Halloween?" she asked, looking down at him with that fishhook grin. "I sure do. You were so cute in your cow costume. You said ooh instead of moo, and the neighbors laughed and said you were adorable." "No," Matt said. "I mean the first time we did this." "Look over there," she said suddenly. "The Holsteins are waving. Let's go see what they have." Matt nodded, following behind her as she led him like a cow to the slaughter. Matthew remembered the first time. He remembered it well. He'd looked up into his mother's eyes and been so excited. He had run down the street, tugging her along as they went house to house to house. That had been the first time he'd seen the man on the corner, the first time he had steered her away from him, not understanding why. He had laughed when the pillowcase had ripped open, spilling his candy in the road, and when his mother had pulled another one out of nowhere, he had started filling that one too. The moon had been full, a big old round Halloween moon, and Matthew reveled in the light of the buttery orb. It had taken him a while to get tired, but he had finally asked Mom if they could go home so he could rest. She had tried to dissuade him, telling him they only had a few more houses, a little while longer. When he asked again, she had tried to push him on, but he had stopped. "I'm tired, Mama. I'm ready to go home." She had turned then, and that was the first time he had noticed the smile. Her smile, that sharp and painful grin that seemed sad as she looked at him, and he had known that there was something off. This wasn't what he had wanted. This hadn't been what he'd wanted. He had just wanted a Halloween that would... Matt swallowed, true fear creeping up in him as he looked at her unnatural smile and noticed that the children had stopped moving around them. He had just wanted a Halloween that would last forever. "Oh, sweetie," his mother had said, "you either get treats or you get tricks." That was when he had seen them for what they truly were. They had circled around him, chanting, "Trick or treat," and as they swarmed in, they had torn him to pieces with their bare hands. All the joy had melted off his face as their nails and teeth dug into him, and when he had woken up on the front porch, his mother asking if he was ready, he had known that something was amiss. "Mady?" Matthew looked up, seeing that Mrs. Holstein had asked him a question. "Sorry, ma'am, what were you saying?" "I asked if you were a scary ghost or not." She was smiling, but it was like Matt could see the bugs crawling under her skin. It made him think that each of them had some kind of centipede or spider beneath their skin, just waiting to leap out. All of them seemed to have something in them, just below the surface, and Matthew was no longer certain he wanted to know what it was. It was hungry, whatever it was, and it seemed to enjoy making him suffer for his slip-ups. "Yes, ma'am. I'm He yawned, feeling wobbly as the candy sack tried to anchor him to the earth. Scary, go. He fell then, not for the first time either. He hit the ground, his mother asking him to get back up, but he was just so tired. Matthew closed his eyes, hoping he would pass out, but it never happened. He could feel the adults looming around him, hear the chants of trick or treat, and when something slammed against his chest, he felt the breath whoosh out of him as it pierced his heart. He hoped it would be over this time, hoped he'd be allowed to die or wake up or whatever this was, but as he heard his mother's voice, he knew it wouldn't happen. Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie? His tired eyes came open, but as he reached for her hand, a new thought occurred. I forgot something inside. I'll be right back. He took a step for the door, but her hand clutched at him, just as it had the last time he'd tried this. It'll be okay. We can get it later. Come on, let's... But then he shoved her, and that seemed to take her by surprise. He ran inside, shutting the door as she got back to her feet. As he turned the deadbolt, she started pounding dully on the hardwood. Now, Mady, you know how this works. You either get the treat, or you get the tricks. He could already hear the muffled cries of trick or treat coming from behind the door, and he backed away slowly as he watched it. He wasn't strong enough to push the couch in front of the door, or even one of the recliners, but he did shove the end table in the hallway over, as he went running up the stairs to close the door to his room behind him. He locked the door and squeezed himself into the corner as he threw the sheet he was still wearing across the room. He could hear a loud thumping coming from downstairs, and he didn't think that door would keep them out for long. He racked his brain, trying to figure out how to get out of this. He thought back across all those trick-or-treating trips, all the nights that had come before this, and his mind always went back to the man in the wide-brimmed hat. He was scared of him in a way that he wasn't of any of the others. Not the bugs or the feral kids or anything he'd seen scared him as much as that man. Why, though? Why did he terrify him so much? Why did he fill him with dread like this? I want you to meet someone. He covered his ears, but the voice wasn't coming from the house. He's kind of important to me, just like you. He put his head between his knees and started crying as the door broke loudly from downstairs, and the words of the children came wafting up to him. I've been seeing him sometimes, after work or while you're at Grandma's for the weekend, and I think he might be... But the rest of it droned down to a low growl as his brain hit the brakes on it. He tried desperately to remember what his mother had said, but he couldn't. His mind struggled with the memory, but as he tried to make it make sense, he heard them pounding on the bedroom door. They were pushing, threatening to break the door, and he curled into a ball as he tried to make the memories come back. Trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat, trick or treat! They came thundering into the room, and as they fell on him, one thought broke the surface above all the others. He needed to face his fears and go see that man. One clear word stuck out in his brain, though, as he was pummeled into oblivion. No. Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie? The words still sounded in his brain, even after the last few times. Matthew had gone along with her for the last however many times, to varying degrees of success. He always avoided the man, always turned her back into the endless cul-de-sac of candy-laden houses, but it always ended the same. He forgot his manners, he went off script and tried to escape. He simply fell over out of exhaustion, and then they had him. He reached for her hand again, and as they walked, his brain tried to argue itself into sense, just like it had the last however many times. They needed to talk to the man at the end of the block. No. Trick or treat, Matt droned, Mr. Deborah smiling as the legs sat just inside his cheeks, a silent warning to be careful. He knows something. Maybe it's how we get out of this. No. Come on, Mom. Let's go to the Andersons, Matt said, stalling for time. They're not going anywhere, honey, she said as he pulled her along, her lips looking chapped as she smiled and smiled. He has to know something. We need to... No. Are you a scary ghost? Miss Holstein asked, and Matt nodded as he told her he was, indeed, a scary ghost. But if we just... No. Matt finally yelled, clutching his head as he fell to his knees in the road. He wanted his brain to shut up. He was tired. He was so tired. He wanted to go to bed. He just wanted this all to end. He just... That's when he noticed that they were looking at him. Matt closed his eyes, and oblivion came on not too much later. Well, not oblivion. Something more like purgatory. Ready to? But he shoved her again and went running down the street, ghost costume flapping as he jumped off the porch. The kids were after him in a second, but Matt didn't care. They would get him, one way or another, but he just needed a break from the constant tricking and treating. He was running up the street, the crowd behind him, and when he looked up, the children seemed to bulge with the scrabbling things as well. They were full of bugs, full of hate, and Matthew needed a way to get beyond this. He turned back just in time to bump into someone, and as he fell down, he covered his head, expecting to be killed by the howling mob. When it didn't come, Matt looked up to see who he had run into. Need a hand up, little buddy? It was the man in the Indiana Jones costume, and to Matt, he looked like the closest thing to an angel he'd ever seen. Matt took his hand, shaking a little as he looked behind him. The mob had stopped, watching the man in confusion, and as Matthew looked up through the eyes of his ghost costume, he became aware that this fellow looked different. He looked real, untouched by this place, and Matt wondered why he'd been afraid of him. "It's great to finally meet you, Matt. Your mother's told me all about you, and I've been looking forward to meeting you. I'm Derek. I guess I'm your mom's..." But the words seemed to slow down, and the dread came back into Matthew. As the mob came back to screaming life, Matt realized why he had been afraid of this guy. Matthew turned, wanting to run away, but he was blinded by bright lights and put his hands up to stop them. As he fell into oblivion, Matthew came to terms with what he had to do, and he hoped that he still had the strength. He needed to face his fears, otherwise he'd be stuck here forever. "Ready to go trick-or-treating, sweetie?" He looked up into his mother's smiling face, the corners of her mouth red as they threatened to crack, and shook his head. "Not yet, Mom. We're missing someone." He reached up and took her hand, and as they walked off towards the thing he feared most, the kids parted for them. They watched him, chanting their infernal mantra, and it seemed that he had the eyes of the entire neighborhood. As he walked towards the swollen moon, he felt it swivel in the sky, and the craters too seemed to watch him as he made a beeline for the spot he had tried to avoid. It wasn't easy. Each step felt like the first step towards a high dive at the pool, or the roller coaster at the amusement park. He could see the man, his hat at a jaunty angle, and as they moved closer to him, all the people around them held their breath. "Julia," Derek said, raising his hand and walking over. "And this must be Matthew. Good to meet you, buddy. I'm Derek." He put out a hand, and Matt shook it heartily. "Mady, I want you to meet someone," his mother said. "He's kind of important, like you, and I've been seeing him sometimes, after work or while you're at Grandma's for the weekend. I think he might be someone you'll be seeing a lot more of in the future. Matthew, this is Derek. He's my boyfriend." Matt told him it was a pleasure to meet him, and he watched the two of them talking quietly, expecting that now things would go back to the way they were. This was it. This was one of those storybook moments that would turn everything back the way it was supposed to be. Matthew smiled as he watched her slip his hand into his, and it felt like everything would be okay now. When the first person began to scream, he felt a little less sure than he had been before. The mob of children had followed them, the adults standing out like sore thumbs amongst them, and many of them were pointing at him. The huge moon that he had thought of as an eye only moments before cracked like an egg as it burst into two pieces. It began to rain something down on them, something that didn't look entirely pleasant. They slapped against his ghost costume wetly, but as one fell across the eye hole, Matt saw that they were bugs. They looked like a cross between a centipede and a spider, and as he threw it away, the crowd began to surge towards him. Matt ran, the only thing he could do, and as his mother and Derek stood amongst the throng of chasers, they looked like rocks in a rushing river. He ran, his sore feet almost spilling him into the road more than once. He'd been so sure that this would work, that this would free him, but now he wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. The creepy crawlies were biting him as they covered the outside of his costume, weighing him down and making him sore. As the mob closed in, their cries of "trick or treat" sounded like a war chant, and Matt saw bright lights coming up fast. He put a hand up, shielding his eyes, but he didn't dare stop running. As the lights bore down on him, he hoped he would wake up anywhere besides the front porch of his house. Heaven, hell, nothingness, whatever was coming next, Matthew welcomed it with open arms. The cries of the mob were driven into blissful silence, only to be replaced by a harsh and rhythmic beeping. Matt opened his eyes as his hand shot up to slap at his ear, making his head ring. He could see a pristine hospital room with a beeping IV pole attached to one arm, and the warm sun of mid-morning outside the big window. His mother was snoring softly as she lay across his feet, and as he moved his prickly legs to make them wake up, she stirred and looked at him in surprise. "Oh my God, Matthew!" She wrapped him in a hug, his IV making him feel pinched, but he was happy to have woken up somewhere different for a change. "Hey, Mom, what's going on?" She smoothed his hair, her eyes wet-looking as she tried to commit him to memory. You got hit by a car, sweetie. You ran away while we were trick-or-treating after..." She opened her mouth like a fish, but shook it off. It's not important. What's important is that you're awake." "Where's Derek?" The vision of the two of them standing stationary as the group of screaming children poured past them, still very vivid in his mind. He's been by a few times. He wanted to make sure you were okay. I told him I might need to take a break, though. I didn't mean to upset you when I told you. I knew it was sudden, but I shouldn't have said it so quickly. I should have eased you into it. I'm sorry, Mady," she said, half crying. It's okay. I was just surprised. I shouldn't have run away. You should call him and let him know that everything's okay." His mother looked shocked, but happy. She'd clearly been worried for a while, but she was happy that Matthew was awake again. She stood up, asking if he wanted something to drink, and Matt nodded in the affirmative. His throat was very dry, and it felt like a while since he had used it properly. It wasn't until the sun set that night that Matthew became anxious again. His mother excused herself, saying she needed to get some food and maybe call Derek and tell him that Matthew was okay. She had sat with him all day, watching cartoons and just kind of holding him, but it appeared that her lack of lunch was catching up with her. The hospital was quieter now, the night shift still in full swing, but she still stopped before heading out the door. "You'll be okay for a few minutes, right? You look a little pale, like there's something on your mind." Matt assured her that he'd be fine, but he was still a little happier once she was out the door. As another yawn shot through him, Matthew thought about how his body would make him sleep soon, and he thought of something he should have considered earlier today. He hadn't noticed right away, but when he had brought his hand down from his ear, he had wiped something onto the sheet. He must have rolled it up in the sheet somehow, because he hadn't thought about it until he had put his hand onto the spot a while later. His mother had been in the bathroom, the door open so she could peek out at him to make sure he hadn't just disappeared, and when he unbound the sheet, he saw something far too familiar there, staining the sheet brown and red as it pressed against him. It was part of the things that had been falling out of the moon, the head and pincers of that strange centipede spider thing. He had picked it up in a napkin and thrown it in the garbage before his mother could see it. But what did it mean? Did it mean all that had been real? Had the creature come from inside his head? Matt didn't know what to think, but he found himself wondering something as he lay there, feeling tired. When he went to sleep, would he wake up in the real world, or would he fall back into that eternal Halloween? Matt was afraid that he might find out soon enough.